Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we begin today's attack report, I want to ask you to subscribe to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us, so please subscribe. Also, write now in the comments which city you're watching from. We'd love to know. All of this because the crisp mountain air filled my lungs as I stepped out of our beat-up Jeep, stretching my arms above my head. The blue mountains of Oregon loomed before us, their peaks shrouded in early morning mist. My brother Sam was already shouldering his backpack, his excitement palpable. "Come on, Em, we're burning daylight," he called out, grinning from ear to ear. I rolled my eyes but couldn't help smiling back. "The sun's barely up, you dork. The trail isn't going anywhere." As I grabbed my own pack from the back seat, a strange feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. I chalked it up to nerves about the 3-day hike ahead of us, but something about the dense forest before us seemed off. Sam was already heading towards the trailhead, his long strides eating up the distance. "Last one to the first marker buys dinner when we get back to civilization." "You're on," I shouted, jogging to catch up. The trail started off easy enough, a well-worn path winding through towering pines and firs. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and small animals going about their morning routines. As we hiked, Sam and I fell into our usual banter, discussing everything from his latest coding project to my struggles with writer's block. About an hour in, we paused for a water break. As I took a swig from my bottle, a twig snapped in the distance, the sound unnaturally loud in the sudden silence that fell over the forest. A chill ran down my spine despite the warm sunlight filtering through the canopy. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Sam furrowed his brow, looking around. "Hear what? Probably just a deer or something." I nodded, trying to shake off the unease. "Yeah, you're probably right. Let's keep moving." As we continued our hike, I couldn't help but feel like we were being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow cast by the ancient trees seemed to hide something just out of sight. I tried to focus on the beauty around us. The vibrant wildflowers, the majestic mountains peeking through gaps in the forest. But the feeling of wrongness persisted. Around midday, we came to a small clearing next to a babbling brook. Sam dropped his pack with a groan of relief. "Perfect spot for lunch, don't you think?" I nodded, grateful for the break. As I sat down on a fallen log, movement at the edge of the clearing caught my eye. "Sam," I said, my voice tight, "look over there." He followed my gaze, his eyes widening as he saw what I'd spotted. There, pressed into the soft mud near the water's edge, was a footprint. But not just any footprint. This one was massive, easily twice the size of Sam's boot, with 5 distinct toes. "Holy shit," Sam breathed, moving closer to examine it. "Em, this is fresh, like, really fresh." My heart began to race as I joined him. The print was deep, indicating whatever made it was incredibly heavy. "Could it be a bear?" I asked, knowing even as the words left my mouth that it wasn't possible. Sam shook his head slowly. "Bears don't have feet like this. I don't know what this is." We stood there for a long moment, the cheerful sound of the brook now seeming discordant and wrong. Finally, Sam straightened up, forcing a smile. "Come on, it's probably just some elaborate prank. You know how hunters and hikers can be." I wanted to believe him, but the footprint seemed all too real. As we ate our sandwiches, my eyes kept darting back to it, half expecting to see some monstrous creature emerge from the tree line. After lunch, we pressed on. The trail began to steepen, and the forest grew denser. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. The birdsong that had accompanied us earlier was now conspicuously absent. "Is it just me, or did it get eerily quiet?" I asked, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. Sam nodded, his earlier bravado diminished. "Yeah, it's weird. Maybe there's a storm coming or something." We pushed on in silence, the only sounds our labored breathing and the crunch of pine needles under our boots. As the afternoon wore on, the sky began to darken, but not with storm clouds. Dusk was approaching far too quickly for my liking. "We should find a spot to make camp," Sam said, checking his watch. "It'll be dark soon." I nodded, relieved at the thought of stopping for the day. We found a small flat area just off the trail and began setting up our tent. As Sam hammered in the stakes, I gathered firewood, never straying too far from our campsite. Just as I was arranging the wood for our fire, an inhuman howl echoed through the mountains. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Not quite wolf, not quite bear, but something primal and terrifying. Sam and I froze, our eyes meeting in shared horror. "What the hell was that?" Sam whispered, his face pale in the fading light. Before I could answer, the howl came again, closer this time. It reverberated through the trees, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My whole body tensed, every instinct screaming at me to run. "Get in the tent," Sam said, his voice low and urgent. "Now!" We scrambled inside, zipping the tent flap closed behind us. It was a flimsy barrier against whatever was out there, but it was better than nothing. We huddled together, straining our ears for any sound of approach. "Do you think it's a wolf?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Sam shook his head. "No wolf I've ever heard of. This is something else." As if in response to his words, a deep rumbling growl came from just beyond our campsite. It was so low I felt it more than heard it, the sound vibrating in my chest. Sam fumbled for his flashlight, his hands shaking. "Should we make a run for it?" I asked, eyeing the tent flap. "And go where?" Sam replied, his voice tight with fear. "We're miles from the car, and whatever that thing is, it's between us and the trail." Another growl, closer now. The tent fabric rippled as if struck by a sudden gust of wind, but the air was eerily still. Something large moved just outside, its shadow briefly visible against the tent wall. "Oh God," I whimpered, clinging to Sam's arm. The flashlight beam caught something moving outside, a massive, dark shape passing by the tent. It was far too big to be a bear, its movements oddly fluid for its size. For a moment, a huge clawed hand pressed against the side of the tent, and I had to bite back a scream. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the presence withdrew. The forest fell silent once more, but it was the silence of a held breath, of prey hiding from a predator. Sam and I remained frozen, barely daring to breathe. Minutes stretched into hours, neither of us willing to check if the coast was clear. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the tent fabric, I finally found my voice. "Sam," I whispered, "what are we going to do?" He took a deep, shuddering breath. "We're going to pack up and get the hell out of here. Whatever that thing was, I don't want to stick around to find out more." As we cautiously emerged from the tent, the forest seemed deceptively normal in the early morning light. But the deep gouges in the earth near our campsite and the lingering musky odor in the air told us that the horrors of the night had been all too real. Little did we know, our ordeal was only beginning. The sun had barely crested the horizon when Sam and I hastily broke camp. The events of the previous night had left us both on edge, jumping at every snapping twig and rustling leaf. As we shouldered our packs and set off down the trail, an oppressive silence hung over the forest. "Maybe we should turn back," I suggested, my voice barely above a whisper. Sam shook his head, his jaw set with determination. "We've come too far to give up now. Besides, the car's further away than the next campsite. We'll be fine if we stick to the trail and keep moving." I wasn't convinced, but I followed him anyway. As we hiked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every shadow seemed to hide a lurking threat. Every gust of wind carried whispers of danger. Around midday, we paused at a small clearing to catch our breath and check the map. That's when I saw it. A massive, dark shape moving swiftly between the trees at the edge of my vision. It was gone in an instant, but the image burned itself into my mind. Too big, too fast to be human. "Sam," I hissed, grabbing his arm. "There's something out there." He looked up from the map, his eyes scanning the tree line. "Where?" "I don't see anything." "It was right there," I pointed with a shaking hand. "Just for a second. It was huge, Sam. He frowned, clearly torn between skepticism and concern. Are you sure it wasn't just a shadow or maybe a bear? I shook my head vehemently. No bear moves like that. It was wrong. Sam's expression softened. He put a comforting hand on my shoulder. Look, Em, we're both on edge after last night. Let's just focus on getting to the next campsite, okay? We'll be safer there. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. As we continued our hike, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see some monstrous creature bearing down on us. The afternoon wore on, and the forest grew denser. The trail narrowed, hemmed in by thick undergrowth and towering trees that blotted out much of the sunlight. The air grew heavy and still, carrying an odd, musky scent that made my nose wrinkle. Do you smell that? I asked Sam, who was a few paces ahead. He paused, sniffing the air. Yeah, it's like wet dog and something rotting. Gross. The stench grew stronger as we pressed on, until it was almost overwhelming. My stomach churned, and I had to fight the urge to gag. That's when I realized the smell was moving, circling us. Sam, I said, my voice tight with fear. We need to get out of here. Now. He turned to look at me, confusion written across his face. What? Why? Before I could answer, a low growl rumbled through the forest. It was the same sound we'd heard the night before, but closer now. Much closer. Sam's eyes widened in recognition. He fumbled for his flashlight, clicking it on despite the daylight. Stay close, he said, his voice barely steady. We stood back to back, Sam sweeping the flashlight beam across the surrounding forest. The growl came again, seeming to come from everywhere at once. Branches snapped in the undergrowth, something large moving just out of sight. Suddenly, Sam's flashlight beam caught a pair of eyes reflecting in the gloom. They were yellow-green, glowing with an unnatural intelligence, and they were far too high off the ground for any normal animal. Oh, God, Sam breathed. Em, run. We took off down the trail, our heavy packs bouncing painfully against our backs. The creature, whatever it was, roared, the sound shaking the very air around us. Heavy footsteps thundered behind us, gaining quickly. Drop your pack, Sam yelled between gasps. It'll slow you down. I didn't hesitate, shrugging off the straps and letting the backpack fall to the ground. Sam did the same, and we ran faster, fueled by pure terror. But it wasn't enough. The creature was too fast, too close. I could hear its labored breathing, feel the heat of its presence just behind us. Suddenly, massive hands reached out from the darkness. I screamed as they barely missed Sam's back, claws raking through the air where he had been a split second before. Left, Sam shouted, veering off the trail into the dense underbrush. I followed, branches whipping at my face and arms as we crashed through the forest. We ran blindly with no idea where we were going. All that mattered was putting distance between us and the monster at our heels. The sound of heavy footsteps and breaking branches was close behind, splintering trees as if they were matchsticks. There, Sam pointed ahead to a narrow crevice in a rocky outcropping. We can squeeze through. We made a final sprint for the opening. I could feel hot breath on the back of my neck, heard the swish of claws cutting through the air just behind me. With a final desperate lunge, we threw ourselves into the crevice. The opening was tight, barely wide enough for us to squeeze through. Jagged rocks scraped against my sides as I pushed myself deeper into the crevice. Behind us, an enraged roar shook the very ground. Massive hands scrabbled at the opening, unable to reach us. Sam and I pressed ourselves as far back as we could, our chests heaving as we struggled to catch our breath. The creature outside growled in frustration, its massive form blocking most of the light from the entrance. What is that thing? I whispered, my voice shaking. Sam shook his head, his face pale in the dim light. I don't know, but it's not giving up. For what felt like hours, we huddled in that tiny space, listening to the creature's attempts to reach us. It would retreat for a while, only to return with renewed vigor, sometimes trying to dig its way in, other times attempting to move the very rocks that sheltered us. As night fell, the attacks became less frequent, but we could still hear it out there, moving around, waiting. We can't stay here forever, I said, my throat dry from thirst and fear. Sam nodded grimly. I know. But we can't go out there in the dark. It has the advantage. We'll have to wait for dawn and make a run for it. I shuddered at the thought but knew he was right. We settled in for a long, terrifying night, taking turns to keep watch while the other dozed fitfully. As the first light of dawn began to filter into our rocky shelter, Sam gently shook me awake. It's time, he whispered. I nodded, steeling myself for what was to come. We hadn't heard the creature for several hours, but that didn't mean it was gone. On 3, Sam said, positioning himself at the entrance. We run as fast as we can and don't look back. Got it? I swallowed hard and nodded. Got it. 1, 2, 3. We burst from the crevice, our muscles screaming in protest after hours of confinement. For a moment, the forest was silent save for our pounding footsteps. Our feet pounded against the forest floor, lungs burning with each desperate breath. The creature's roar still echoed behind us, spurring us on despite our exhaustion. Sam led the way, his longer legs giving him a slight advantage as we weaved between trees and leapt over fallen logs. Keep going, Sam shouted over his shoulder. Don't stop. I pushed myself harder, ignoring the burning in my muscles and the sharp sting of branches whipping across my face. The sound of pursuit grew louder, heavy footfalls and splintering wood drawing ever closer. Suddenly, Sam skidded to a halt, nearly causing me to crash into him. Dead end, he cried, gesturing at the sheer rock face looming before us. We spun around, searching frantically for an escape route. The forest seemed to close in around us, shadows deepening despite the morning light. A low, rumbling growl emanated from the trees, raising the hair on the back of my neck. There. I pointed to a narrow gap between 2 massive boulders. We might be able to squeeze through. We sprinted for the opening, hope surging through our tired bodies. But just as we neared our potential salvation, a massive, dark shape burst from the underbrush. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before, a wall of matted fur and rippling muscle, easily 8 feet tall. Before I could react, it slammed into Sam with terrifying force, sending him flying into a nearby tree with a sickening crack. Sam! I screamed, watching in horror as my brother crumpled to the ground, motionless. The creature turned its attention to me, yellow eyes glowing with predatory intent. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling as I tried to process what I was seeing. It was like a nightmarish amalgamation of ape and man, a BigFoot, my brain supplied hysterically. As the monster advanced, I grabbed a fallen branch, wielding it like a club. Stay back! I yelled, my voice cracking with fear. The Bigfoot's lips curled back in a snarl, revealing yellowed fangs larger than my fingers. Its hot, rancid breath washed over me as it roared, the sound so loud it seemed to shake the very air around us. Driven by desperate courage, I swung the branch at the creature's head. It caught the makeshift weapon effortlessly, snapping it like a twig in its massive hand. Before I could react, it lashed out, razor-sharp claws tearing into my arm. I cried out in pain, warm blood seeping through my shredded sleeve. The Bigfoot grabbed me by the shoulders, its grip crushingly strong. I struggled frantically, kicking and clawing at its matted fur. Let go of me, I screamed, terror lending strength to my efforts. A pained groan from behind the creature caught my attention. Sam was stirring, slowly pushing himself up from the forest floor. The Bigfoot's head whipped around at the sound, momentarily distracted. Seizing the opportunity, I drove my knee up into the monster's midsection with all my strength. It grunted, its grip loosening just enough for me to wrench free. I stumbled backward, putting some distance between us. Sam, I called out, get up, we have to run. My brother looked up, his eyes widening in horror as he took in the scene before him. Blood trickled down the side of his face from a nasty gash on his forehead. Emily, what is that thing? Before I could respond, the Bigfoot let out another ear-splitting roar. It charged toward Sam, massive arms outstretched. No, I screamed. launching myself at the creature's back. I wrapped my arms around its thick neck, trying desperately to pull it away from my brother. The stench of wet fur and rotting meat was overwhelming, making me gag. The Bigfoot bellowed in rage, reaching back to claw at me. Its razor-sharp nails raked across my back, tearing through my shirt and into flesh. I cried out in pain but held on, determined to give Sam a chance to escape. "Run, Sam," I yelled through gritted teeth. "Get out of here." But Sam didn't run. Instead, he grabbed a large rock from the ground and hurled it at the creature's head. The projectile struck home with a dull thud, causing the Bigfoot to stumble. I lost my grip and fell to the ground, the impact knocking the wind out of me. Through blurry vision, I saw the monster advance on Sam, who was frantically searching for another weapon. "Hey!" I shouted, struggling to my feet. "Over here, you overgrown fur ball!" The Bigfoot whirled around, its yellow eyes locking onto me. It let out a low, menacing growl that sent shivers down my spine. For a moment, we stood frozen in a twisted tableau, the monster, my brother, and me, all waiting to see who would make the next move. Then, with frightening speed, the creature lunged at Sam. Its massive hands wrapped around my brother's torso, lifting him off the ground as if he weighed nothing. Sam's screams of terror turned to pain as the monster began to crush him. I could hear the sickening creak of bones straining under the immense pressure. "Stop!" I cried out, my voice raw with desperation. "Let him go!" I charged forward, grabbing a sharp stick from the ground. With all my strength, I drove it into the Bigfoot's side. The creature roared in pain and fury, momentarily loosening its grip on Sam. But my small victory was short-lived. With a backhanded swipe, the monster sent me flying. I hit the ground hard, my vision swimming as pain exploded through my body. Through the haze, I watched in helpless horror as the beast effortlessly lifted my brother and began to drag him into the forest. Sam's eyes met mine, wide with terror and pain. "Emily!" he cried out, struggling weakly against the Bigfoot's iron grip. "Help me!" I tried to push myself up, but my limbs wouldn't cooperate. The world spun around me, darkness creeping in at the edges of my vision. "Sam!" I whispered, reaching out a trembling hand. But it was too late. The Bigfoot disappeared into the dense underbrush, taking my brother with it. Sam's desperate cries grew fainter, until all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. As consciousness slipped away, one thought echoed through my mind. I had failed. The monster had taken Sam, and I had been powerless to stop it. Consciousness returned slowly, each ragged breath sending waves of pain through my battered body. I blinked, trying to focus on my surroundings. The forest was eerily quiet, shadows lengthening as dusk approached. How long had I been out? Then it all came rushing back. The chase, the attack, Sam. "Sam!" I croaked, pushing myself up despite my protesting muscles. Panic surged through me as I remembered the Bigfoot dragging my brother away. I staggered to my feet, fighting a wave of dizziness. "Sam!" I called out again, louder this time. "Where are you?" A faint groan answered me, coming from a dense patch of undergrowth nearby. Heart pounding, I stumbled towards the sound, pushing aside branches and leaves. There, half hidden beneath a fallen log, was Sam. His face was deathly pale, streaked with dirt and blood, but he was alive. "Oh God, Sam," I choked out, dropping to my knees beside him. I thought it took you." He coughed weakly, grimacing in pain. "Almost did," he rasped. "Dropped me when you stabbed it. Managed to crawl away while it was distracted." Relief flooded through me, quickly followed by a renewed sense of urgency. "We need to get out of here," I said, glancing nervously at the deepening shadows around us. "That thing could come back any minute." Sam nodded, then winced at the movement. "Don't think I can walk," he admitted. "Pretty sure some ribs are broken, maybe worse." I swallowed hard, forcing down my rising panic. "I'll help you. We just need to get to the ranger station. They'll have a radio, can call for help." As gently as I could, I helped Sam to his feet. He leaned heavily on me, his breathing labored and punctuated by barely suppressed groans of pain. We had only taken a few halting steps when a bone-chilling roar echoed through the forest. "It's coming back," Sam whispered, his eyes wide with fear. Adrenaline surged through my system, temporarily dulling the ache of my own injuries. "We need to move. Now." We shuffled forward as quickly as we could, every step an agonizing ordeal for Sam. The sounds of pursuit grew louder, branches snapping, undergrowth being trampled by something massive and angry. "Leave me," Sam gasped between pained breaths. "You can move faster alone." I tightened my grip on him. Not a chance. We're getting out of this together or not at all. A thunderous crash behind us spurred us to move faster. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. The BigFoot was there, its yellow eyes gleaming with malevolent intelligence in the fading light. A dark stain matted the fur on its side where I had stabbed it earlier, but the wound seemed to have only enraged it further. "Oh, shit," I breathed. "Sam, we need to run." He nodded grimly, gritting his teeth against the pain. We broke into an awkward, stumbling run, Sam leaning heavily on me with each step. The creature roared again, closer now. I could hear its heavy breathing, the thud of its massive feet against the forest floor. Panic threatened to overwhelm me, but I forced it down. We just needed to stay ahead of it, to find some way to slow it down. My eyes landed on a fallen branch just ahead, thick and sturdy. An idea formed, born of desperation and the primal need to survive. "Sam," I panted, "I need you to hold on for just a second." He nodded, bracing himself against a tree as I lunged for the branch. I hefted it, feeling its weight. It wasn't much, but it was all we had. The BigFoot burst into view, its massive form filling the space between the trees. Up close, it was even more terrifying. All rippling muscle and matted fur, with hands that ended in razor-sharp claws. Its lips pulled back in a snarl, revealing yellowed fangs. Adrenaline surging through me, I gripped the fallen branch and swung it at the creature's head with all my might. The impact reverberated up my arms, nearly causing me to drop the makeshift weapon. The BigFoot stumbled back, more surprised than hurt, but it was enough. "Run!" I screamed at Sam, grabbing his arm and pulling him along. We stumbled through the gathering darkness, the BigFoot's furious roar shaking the ground behind us. I could hear trees splintering as it gave chase, its rage lending it impossible speed. Sam's breath came in ragged gasps, and I could feel him weakening with each step. Blood dripped from his various wounds, leaving a macabre trail on the forest floor. I knew we couldn't keep this pace for long. "There!" Sam wheezed, pointing ahead. "A cave!" I squinted through the gloom and saw it. A dark opening in a rocky outcropping. It was our only chance. We veered towards the cave, pushing our battered bodies to their limits. My lungs burned and my vision blurred, desperation fueling each step. Behind us, the sounds of pursuit grew ever closer. Just as we reached the cave entrance, I felt something brush against my back. A clawed hand, missing me by inches. I shoved Sam into the narrow opening, diving in after him. We scrambled deeper into the cave, pressed against the cold stone walls. Outside, the BigFoot roared in frustration, too large to follow us into the tight space. For several heart-stopping moments, we listened to it rage outside, trying to reach us. Massive hands scrabbled at the cave entrance, showering us with loose pebbles and dirt. But gradually the attacks lessened, and eventually, silence fell. Sam and I huddled in the darkness, hardly daring to breathe. Minutes stretched into hours, but we didn't move, terrified that the creature was still out there, waiting. As the first light of dawn began to filter into the cave, Sam finally broke the silence. "Do you think it's gone?" he whispered. I shook my head, wincing at the movement. "I don't know, but we can't stay here forever. We need to get you to a doctor." Cautiously, we made our way to the cave entrance. The forest outside seemed peaceful in the early morning light. No sign of the nightmarish creature that had hunted us. "Okay," I said, taking a deep breath. Let's make a run for it. The ranger station can't be too far now. Sam nodded grimly, his face pale with pain and exhaustion. Lead the way, sis. We emerged from the cave, every sense on high alert. The forest was quiet, too quiet. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals. It was as if the entire ecosystem was holding its breath, waiting. We had only taken a few steps when a twig snapped somewhere behind us. We froze, hearts pounding. Emily, Sam whispered, his voice tight with fear. Run. A low, rumbling growl confirmed our worst fears. The hunt wasn't over yet. The ambulance screeched to a halt outside the emergency room, its siren cutting off abruptly and leaving an eerie silence in its wake. The back doors burst open and a flurry of activity erupted as paramedics rushed Sam's stretcher into the hospital. I stumbled after them, my own injuries forgotten in the face of my brother's dire condition. Harsh fluorescent lights assaulted my eyes as we entered the ER, making the night's event seem like a surreal nightmare. The sterile smell of disinfectant mixed with the metallic tang of blood, turning my stomach. Male, mid-20s, multiple fractures, possible internal bleeding. One of the paramedics rattled off to the waiting trauma team. BP's dropping, pulses thready. Doctors and nurses swarmed around Sam's broken body, their urgent whispers doing little to calm my racing heart. I tried to follow as they wheeled him away, but a gentle hand on my arm held me back. Miss, you need to let them work, a kind-faced nurse said. Let's get you looked at, okay? I shook my head, trying to pull away. No, I need to stay with him. He's my brother, I can't leave him alone. The nurse's grip tightened slightly. Your brother is in good hands, but you're injured too, and we need to take care of those wounds. As if on cue, the adrenaline that had been keeping me going began to ebb and the pain came crashing in. My arm throbbed where the creature's claws had torn into it, and every breath sent daggers of pain through my ribs. Okay, I conceded weakly, allowing the nurse to lead me to an examination room. As the medical staff cleaned and dressed my wounds, I found myself drifting, the events of the past 24 hours playing on repeat in my mind. The chase through the forest, the terrifying encounter with the BigFoot, Sam's screams of pain. It all seemed too horrific to be real. Miss, can you hear me? I blinked, focusing on the doctor standing before me. He was frowning, concern etched on his face. Sorry, what? I mumbled. I asked if you could tell me what happened, he repeated patiently. These injuries are unusual. I took a deep breath, wincing at the pain in my ribs. We were hiking in the Blue Mountains, I began, my voice shaky. There was something out there. It attacked us. The doctor's frown deepened. Something? What do you mean? It was huge, I said, the words tumbling out now. Like a man, but bigger, covered in fur. It tried to take Sam. We barely got away. As I spoke, I became acutely aware of the skeptical looks being exchanged between the doctor and nurses. Their expressions ranged from concern to outright disbelief. A large animal attack, perhaps? The doctor suggested gently. A bear, maybe? I shook my head vehemently. No, you don't understand. It wasn't a bear. It was a BigFoot. The moment the words left my mouth, I regretted them. The doctor's expression shifted from skepticism to something closer to pity. I see, he said carefully. Well, you've been through a traumatic experience. It's not uncommon for the mind to fill in gaps with unusual explanations. You don't believe me, I said flatly. He patted my uninjured arm. What's important now is that you rest and recover. We'll need to keep you overnight for observation given the severity of your injuries. As he turned to leave, I called out, Wait, how's Sam? Is he okay? The doctor paused at the door. Your brother is in surgery. His injuries are severe, but he's young and strong. We're doing everything we can. With that, he left. leaving me alone with my thoughts and the lingering phantom sensation of the monster's claws tearing into my flesh. The hours crawled by. Despite my exhaustion, sleep eluded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the Bigfoot's rage-filled face, heard its bone-chilling roar. The skeptical looks from the hospital staff replayed in my mind, making me question my own sanity. Had it really happened? Or was my brain trying to make sense of a simple, if tragic, hiking accident? Just as dawn began to break, a nurse entered my room. "Your brother is out of surgery," she informed me. "He's in the ICU. You can see him now, if you feel up to it." I nodded, pushing myself up despite the protest from my battered body. "Please take me to him." The ICU was quieter than the ER, but no less intimidating. Machines beeped steadily, monitoring vital signs and delivering crucial medications. Sam lay in a bed surrounded by equipment, his face pale and drawn beneath a maze of tubes and wires. "Oh, Sam," I whispered, gently taking his hand. It felt small and fragile in mine, nothing like the strong grip I was used to. To my surprise, his eyes fluttered open. For a moment, they were unfocused, clouded with pain and medication. Then they locked onto mine, and the terror I saw in them confirmed that the nightmare had been all too real. He croaked, his voice barely audible. It was real, wasn't it?" I nodded, tears welling up in my eyes. "Yeah, it was real. But we made it, Sam. We're safe now." He shook his head weakly. "No, not safe. It's still out there." A chill ran down my spine at his words. Before I could respond, a doctor entered the room, clipboard in hand. "Ah, Mr. Thompson, you're awake," he said briskly. "How are you feeling?" Sam's grip on my hand tightened. "Like I got hit by a truck," he mumbled. "What's the damage, Doc?" The doctor consulted his clipboard. "Multiple fractures, including several ribs and your left arm. Internal bleeding, which we've managed to control. Numerous lacerations and contusions. You're lucky to be alive, Mr. Thompson." "Lucky," Sam repeated, a humorless laugh escaping him. "Yeah, that's us. Real lucky." The doctor frowned. "Can you tell me what happened out there?" Sam's eyes met mine, a silent communication passing between us. I gave a small nod, encouraging him to tell the truth, consequences be damned. "We were attacked," Sam said, his voice stronger now. "By something not natural. Big, strong, like a man, but more." The doctor's frown deepened. "Your sister mentioned something similar. A large animal, perhaps?" "No," Sam insisted. "It was intelligent. Tracked us. Hunted us." "I see," the doctor said, his tone carefully neutral. "Well, you've been through a traumatic experience. It's not uncommon for the mind to create explanations." Sam's grip on my hand became almost painful. "You think we're crazy?" he said flatly. The doctor sighed. "I think you've been through something terrible, and your minds are trying to make sense of it. For now, focus on resting and recovering. We'll have a psychiatrist come by later to talk with both of you." As he left, Sam turned to me, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and determination. We can't stay here," he whispered urgently. "They don't believe us. And if that thing followed us—" I nodded, understanding his fear all too well. "I know. But you're in no condition to move, Sam. We need to heal first." "And then what?" he asked. "Go back to our lives like nothing happened? Pretend it was all in our heads?" I shook my head. "No. We find answers. Someone out there must know something about what we saw. We're not the first to encounter it, I'm sure of that." Sam relaxed slightly, some of the tension leaving his battered body. "Okay," he murmured. "We'll heal. Then we'll find answers." As Sam drifted off to sleep, likely aided by the cocktail of painkillers flowing through his system, I settled into the uncomfortable chair beside his bed. Despite the safety of the hospital, despite the rational part of my brain insisting that we were out of danger, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I found myself staring out the window, half expecting to see a massive, fur-covered face peering in at us. The rational part of my mind knew it was impossible. We were on the 5th floor, after all. But after what we'd been through, rationality seemed a flimsy defense against the horrors lurking in the shadows. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, bathing the room in warm light, I made a silent vow. We would heal, yes. We would let the doctors patch our bodies back together. But we wouldn't forget. We wouldn't let ourselves be convinced it was all in our heads. And when we were strong enough, we would find answers. Because if that thing was still out there, still hunting, then no one was truly safe. 2 weeks after our harrowing ordeal in the Blue Mountains, Sam and I found ourselves seated across from Sheriff John Hawkins in his cramped office. The walls were adorned with faded photographs of local landscapes and mounted animal heads, trophies from successful hunting trips, no doubt. The irony wasn't lost on me. "Now let me get this straight," Sheriff Hawkins drawled, leaning back in his creaking chair. "You're saying what exactly? A Bigfoot attacked you?" I could feel my frustration rising, but I fought to keep my voice level. "I know how it sounds, Sheriff, but that's what we saw. It wasn't a bear, or a wolf, or any other animal native to these parts." The sheriff's patronizing tone made my blood boil as he responded, "Miss Thompson, I've been patrolling these woods for nigh on 30 years. I've seen just about every critter that calls this place home, but I ain't never seen no Bigfoot." "Just because you haven't seen it doesn't mean it doesn't exist," I shot back, my patience wearing thin. Sam, who had been uncharacteristically quiet throughout the interview, finally spoke up. "Sheriff, we know what we saw. We've got the scars to prove it." Sheriff Hawkins sighed, rubbing his temple. "Look, I don't doubt you two went through something awful out there. But Bigfoot? Come on now. We've got park rangers combing the area where you say this happened. They haven't found a lick of evidence to support your story." "What about our campsite?" I asked. "Our backpacks? We left everything behind when we ran." The sheriff shook his head. "Nothing. No campsite, no backpacks, no signs of any large animal activity outside the norm." I felt a chill run down my spine. How was that possible? Had the creature been intelligent enough to cover its tracks? Or were we truly losing our minds? "Now, I've got a theory," Sheriff Hawkins continued, his tone softening slightly. "You two had a run-in with a bear. It's traumatic, sure. The mind plays tricks on you in situations like that. It's not uncommon for folks to misremember details, especially when they're scared out of their wits." I opened my mouth to argue, but Sam placed a hand on my arm, shaking his head slightly. I could see the defeat in his eyes, the weariness etched into his face. This wasn't a battle we were going to win. "Thank you for your time, Sheriff," Sam said, standing up slowly, his movement still stiff from his healing injuries. "We appreciate your department looking into this." As we left the sheriff's office, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were giving up too easily. But one look at Sam's drawn face told me he couldn't take much more of this. Outside, a small crowd of reporters had gathered, alerted to our presence by some leak in the department. They swarmed around us as we exited the building, microphones thrust in our faces and cameras flashing. "Miss Thompson, can you tell us about the Bigfoot attack? Mr. Thompson, do you stand by your story? Are you concerned about copycat pranksters taking advantage of your claims?" The barrage of questions was overwhelming. I tried to push through the crowd, shielding Sam as best I could. "No comment," I repeated, again and again like a mantra. Finally breaking free of the press, we made it to our car. As I started the engine, I could see Sam's hands shaking. "You okay?" I asked softly. He shook his head, staring straight ahead. "I can't do this anymore, Em. I can't keep reliving that night, trying to convince people who are never going to believe us." "Sam?" "No," he cut me off. "I'm done. I just want to forget it ever happened." The drive home was silent, the weight of unspoken words hanging heavy between us. Over the next few weeks, I watched helplessly as Sam withdrew further into himself. He rarely left his apartment, ignored calls from friends, and refused to speak about that night in the mountains. The psychological scars ran deep, deeper perhaps than the physical ones that were still healing. One evening, after another failed attempt to draw Sam out, I found myself alone in my living room, laptop open before me. The screen glowed with dozens of open tabs, blurry photos, questionable accounts, and pseudoscientific articles all claiming evidence of Bigfoot's existence. I knew I was becoming obsessed, but I couldn't help it. Every new piece of information, no matter how dubious, felt like validation. We weren't crazy. We hadn't imagined it. Something was out there. A knock at the door startled me from my research. Cautiously, I approached, peering through the peephole. A man I didn't recognize stood outside, shifting nervously from foot to foot. "Who is it?" I called out. "Miss Thompson? My name is Dr. Alan Forrester. I'm a cryptozoologist. I think I might be able to help you." Against my better judgment, I opened the door. Dr. Forrester was a small, wiry man with thick glasses and a nervous energy about him. He clutched a battered leather briefcase to his chest like a lifeline. "I'm sorry to show up unannounced," he said, words tumbling out in a rush. "But I've been following your story and I believe you. I've been studying Bigfoot sightings for years, and your account matches several other documented encounters." I hesitated, torn between hope and skepticism. "You believe us? You don't think we're crazy?" Dr. Forrester shook his head emphatically. "Not at all. May I come in? I have some information I think you'll find very interesting." I stepped aside, allowing him to enter. As he settled onto my couch, pulling papers and photographs from his briefcase, I felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in weeks. For hours, we pored over Dr. Forrester's research. He had accounts dating back decades, all describing creatures similar to what Sam and I had encountered. There were grainy photographs, plaster casts of enormous footprints, and even a few hair samples that defied classification. "You see," Dr. Forrester explained, his eyes alight with enthusiasm. "There's too much evidence to dismiss. These creatures are real, Miss Thompson. Rare, elusive, but very real." "But why hasn't anyone captured clear footage?" I asked. "In this age of smartphones and trail cams, you'd think someone would have gotten irrefutable proof by now." Dr. Forrester nodded as if he'd been expecting this question. "That's the fascinating part. I believe these creatures possess a level of intelligence we can scarcely comprehend. They've learned to avoid human detection, perhaps even developed ways to interfere with our technology." It sounded far-fetched, but after what I'd seen, I was willing to entertain even the wildest theories. "There's more," Dr. Forrester continued, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "I have reason to believe that certain government agencies are aware of these creatures' existence. There have been cover-ups, Miss Thompson, evidence destroyed, witnesses silenced." A chill ran down my spine. "Are you saying we're in danger?" He shrugged. "It's hard to say, but I would advise caution. Your story has attracted a lot of attention. There are those who would prefer it if you simply forgot what you saw." As if on cue, a car door slammed outside. I rushed to the window, peering out into the darkness. A black SUV with tinted windows was parked across the street, its engine still running. "Dr. Forrester," I said, my voice tight with fear, "I think you should go." He nodded, hastily gathering his papers. "Of course. But please take this." He pressed a USB drive into my hand. "All my research is on here. Keep it safe." As I closed the door behind him, my mind was reeling. What had we stumbled into? Was this all some elaborate hoax, or were we on the verge of uncovering a truth too big to comprehend? I spent the rest of the night reviewing the files on the USB drive, each new piece of information adding to the growing sense of unease in the pit of my stomach. By the time dawn broke, I knew what I had to do. I called Sam, praying he would pick up. To my relief, he answered on the third ring. "Em, what's wrong?" His voice was groggy with sleep. "Sam, I need you to listen carefully," I said, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. "Pack a bag. Only essentials. I'll pick you up in an hour. What? Why? What's going on? I took a deep breath. I think I've found proof, Sam. Proof that we're not crazy. But I also think we might be in danger. We need to go now. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then, okay, I'll be ready. As I threw some clothes and supplies into a duffel bag, my eyes fell on the framed photo of Sam and me from our last camping trip before the attack. We were smiling, blissfully unaware of the horrors that awaited us in those mountains. I picked up the photo, running my fingers over the glass. "We're going to find answers," I whispered, as much to myself as to the smiling faces in the picture. "And then we're going to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." With one last glance around my apartment, I shouldered my bag and headed for the door. The investigation was far from over. In fact, I realized as I stepped out into the early morning light it was only just beginning. The digital clock on my nightstand blinked 3:17 a.m. as I jolted awake, a scream dying in my throat. Sweat plastered my hair to my forehead, and my heart raced as if I'd just run a marathon. The nightmare, always the same, lingered at the edges of my consciousness. The creature's bone-chilling roar, Sam's agonized screams, the feeling of utter helplessness as I watched my brother being dragged away. I sat up, rubbing my eyes and trying to shake off the residual terror. Sleep had become a luxury since our encounter in the Blue Mountains, each night a battle against the horrors that awaited in my subconscious. "It's okay," I whispered to myself, a mantra I'd repeated countless times over the past months. "We're safe. It's over." But even as the words left my lips, I knew they were a lie. It wasn't over. The creature was still out there, and the fear that had taken root in my soul showed no signs of withering. Unable to face the prospect of more nightmares, I got up and made my way to the kitchen. The house was eerily quiet, the silence broken only by the soft hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the old clock on the wall. I poured myself a glass of water, my hand shaking slightly as I lifted it to my lips. A sudden thump from outside made me freeze, the glass slipping from my grasp and shattering on the tile floor. Heart pounding, I peered out the window, searching the darkness for any sign of movement. The trees at the edge of our property swayed gently in the night breeze, their shadows dancing in a way that made my skin crawl. Was that a flash of yellow eyes in the underbrush? A glimpse of matted fur between the trees? Logic told me it was impossible. We were miles from the mountains in a quiet suburban neighborhood, but fear had long since overridden logic. I spent the rest of the night huddled on the couch, every creak of the house and rustle of leaves outside setting my nerves on edge. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows, I finally allowed myself to relax, if only slightly. The monsters, it seemed, retreated with the night. Later that morning, I drove to Sam's apartment for our weekly check-in. These visits had become a ritual of sorts, a way for us to reassure ourselves that we weren't alone in our trauma. As I pulled into the parking lot, I couldn't help but notice how unkempt the building looked. Peeling paint, overgrown shrubs, a general air of neglect that seemed to mirror Sam's own decline. I knocked on his door, calling out, "Sam? It's me. You decent?" After a moment, I heard the shuffling of feet and the click of locks being undone. The door opened to reveal Sam, and my heart sank at the sight of him. His once athletic frame had grown gaunt, dark circles under his eyes a testament to his own sleepless nights. The haunted look in his eyes told me more than words ever could. He'd never be the same after what we'd been through. "Hey, Em," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "Come on in." I followed him into the apartment, trying not to wrinkle my nose at the stale air and unwashed dishes piled in the sink. Sam had never been a neat freak, but this level of disorder was new and worrying. "How are you holding up?" I asked, knowing the question was inadequate but not sure what else to say. Sam shrugged, collapsing onto the couch. "Same as always. You?" I settled into an armchair across from him, absently noting the half-empty whiskey bottle on the coffee table. "About the same. The nightmares are getting worse." He nodded. a flicker of understanding passing between us. Yeah, me too. I keep seeing its face, you know? Those eyes. I shuddered, the image all too vivid in my own mind. Have you thought any more about seeing that therapist I mentioned? Dr. Rosenberg specializes in PTSD. She might be able to help. Sam's face hardened. And tell her what exactly? That I'm having nightmares about being attacked by BigFoot? That I jump at every shadow because I'm afraid some mythical monster is going to come crashing through my window? She'll have me committed, Em. She might believe us, I said, though I knew how unlikely that was. Or at least she might be able to help us process the trauma without focusing on the specifics of what caused it. He shook his head. No shrink is going to fix this, Em. Nothing's going to fix this. We're broken, and that's just how it is now. The defeat in his voice broke my heart. This wasn't the Sam I knew, the adventurous, optimistic brother who had always been my rock. The creature had taken more than just our sense of safety. It had stolen a fundamental part of who we were. We can't give up, I insisted, leaning forward. We have to keep fighting, keep searching for answers. Dr. Forrester's research. Don't. Sam cut me off, his voice sharp. Don't start with that conspiracy theory bullshit again. It's not helping anyone, Em. It's just keeping us stuck in this nightmare. I bit back a retort, knowing that pushing the issue would only drive him further away. Instead, I changed the subject. Have you talked to Mom and Dad lately? Sam's bitter laugh told me all I needed to know. Oh yeah, that went great. Dad thinks we're attention-seeking liars, and Mom's convinced we're both having some kind of shared psychotic break. Real supportive, those two. The mention of our parents sent a pang of guilt through me. They had tried, in their own way, to be understanding. But their disbelief, their insistence that we must have imagined or exaggerated what happened, had created a rift that seemed insurmountable. They're just worried about us, I said, though the words rang hollow even to my own ears. They think we're crazy, Em. Hell, sometimes I think we're crazy. Maybe we did imagine it all. Maybe we just had a run-in with a bear and our minds couldn't handle it. I shook my head vehemently. No, Sam. We know what we saw, what we experienced. It was real. He didn't respond, his gaze fixed on some point in the distance. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken fears and shared trauma. Finally, I stood up. I should get going. I've got a thing. The lie was transparent, but Sam didn't call me on it. We both knew I just couldn't bear to see him like this any longer. Yeah, sure, he mumbled. Thanks for stopping by. As I reached the door, I turned back. Sam, promise me you'll at least think about the therapy. Please? He met my eyes for a brief moment, and I saw a flicker of the old Sam there. I'll think about it, he said softly. It wasn't much, but it was something. I left his apartment with a mixture of hope and despair warring in my chest. The drive home took me past the local park, a place that had once been a source of joy and relaxation. Now, the trees lining the path seemed menacing, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. Every shadow held the potential for danger, every rustle of leaves a harbinger of terror. I found myself gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, my eyes darting from the road to the tree line and back again. A jogger emerged from a path and I nearly swerved off the road in panic before my brain registered that it was just a normal person, not some monstrous creature. By the time I made it home, my nerves were frayed to the breaking point. I fumbled with my keys, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds as if expecting to see the BigFoot lumbering up the driveway. Once inside, I leaned against the closed door, trying to calm my racing heart. This constant state of fear was unsustainable, I knew. But how could I ever feel safe again, knowing what was out there? The rest of the day passed in a blur of anxiety and hypervigilance. Every sound made me jump. The neighbor's dog barking, a car backfiring down the street, the wind rustling through the trees in the backyard. By evening, I was exhausted, my body aching from the constant tension. As night fell, I found myself going through my now familiar lockdown routine. Check all the windows and doors, pull the curtains tight, turn on every light in the house. It was irrational, I knew. If the creature wanted to get in, a locked door wouldn't stop it. But the ritual provided a small measure of comfort, an illusion of control in a world that had spun so far out of my grasp. I settled onto the couch, TV droning in the background, more for the comforting noise than any real interest in the programs. My laptop sat open on the coffee table, dozens of tabs open to various cryptozoology forums and BigFoot sighting reports. I knew I should close it, try to focus on something, anything else. But the pull of potential answers was too strong to resist. As I scrolled through yet another blurry photo purporting to show a Bigfoot in some distant forest, my phone buzzed with an incoming text. It was from Lena, my best friend since college, or at least she used to be. "Hey, Em, haven't heard from you in a while. Everything okay?" I stared at the message, a lump forming in my throat. Lena had tried to be supportive after the attack, but as weeks turned to months and Sam and I remained fixated on our experience, she had gradually pulled away. Our last conversation had ended in an argument, with Lena insisting we needed to move on, and me unable to make her understand that moving on wasn't an option. I typed out several responses, deleting each one before finally settling on a simple, "I'm fine, just busy." Her reply came quickly. "Look, I know things have been weird between us, but I'm worried about you, Em. Maybe we could grab coffee sometime, talk?" The offer was tempting. Part of me desperately wanted to reconnect, to try and reclaim some semblance of normalcy. But the thought of sitting in a crowded cafe trying to make small talk while constantly scanning for threats was exhausting. "Thanks, but I'm not really up for going out these days. Another time, maybe." I could almost hear Lena's sigh of frustration through her next message. "Em, you can't keep isolating yourself like this. It's not healthy. Please let me help." Tears pricked at my eyes as I responded, "You can't help, Lena. No one can." "I'm sorry." I turned off my phone before she could reply, guilt and loneliness warring in my chest. Lena was right. This isolation wasn't healthy. But how could I explain to her, to anyone, the constant fear that gripped me? How could I make them understand that every moment felt like I was balanced on a knife's edge, waiting for the other shoe to drop? A sudden crash from the kitchen made me leap to my feet, heart pounding. I grabbed the baseball bat I now kept by the couch and crept towards the sound, every nerve on high alert. As I rounded the corner, I saw the source of the noise. A cabinet had come open, spilling pots and pans onto the floor. I let out a shaky laugh, equal parts relief and hysteria. "Get it together, Em," I muttered to myself, setting the bat aside and kneeling to clean up the mess. As I reached for a fallen pot, movement outside the window caught my eye. I froze, barely daring to breathe as I peered into the darkness. For a moment, I could have sworn I saw a large, shadowy figure moving between the trees at the edge of the yard. But I blinked, and it was gone. My hands shook as I finished putting away the pots and pans, my mind racing. Had I really seen something, or was my imagination playing tricks on me again? The rational part of my brain insisted it was nothing. A deer, maybe, or just shadows moving in the wind. But the part of me that had felt the Bigfoot's hot breath on my face, that had seen its yellow eyes gleaming with predatory intelligence, wasn't so sure. I spent the rest of the night huddled on the couch, baseball bat clutched to my chest, jumping at every creak of the house settling and rustle of leaves outside. As dawn broke, casting long shadows across the living room, I finally allowed myself to relax slightly. The monsters, it seemed, retreated with the night. But as I dragged myself to the shower, preparing to face another day of constant vigilance and barely contained terror, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were always there, just beyond the edge of sight, waiting for their moment to strike again. Later that morning, as I sipped my third cup of coffee in an attempt to shake off the exhaustion of another sleepless night, my phone rang. It was Sam. "Hey," I answered, trying to keep the worry out of my voice. Sam rarely called, preferring to communicate via text if at all. "Everything okay?" There was a long pause before he spoke, his voice tight with an emotion I couldn't quite place. I think I saw it last night." My blood ran cold. What do you mean you saw it? Saw what? You know what? He said, his voice barely above a whisper. It was outside my apartment just for a second, but God, those eyes. I'd recognize them anywhere. I sank into a chair, my legs suddenly too weak to support me. Are you sure? It couldn't have been, I don't know, a bear or something? In the middle of the city? Sam's laugh was bitter, edged with hysteria. No, it wasn't a fucking bear, Em. It was him. Whatever you want to call it. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was telling me. But that's impossible. We're hundreds of miles from where it attacked us. It can't be here. Yeah, well, tell that to the thing I saw staring at me through my bedroom window at 3 a.m., Sam snapped. Then softer. I'm scared, Em. Really scared. What if it followed us? What if it's not done with us? The thought sent a chill down my spine. I'd been so focused on the trauma of what had happened, on trying to prove to others that our experience was real, that I hadn't considered the possibility that the danger might not be over. Okay, I said, trying to keep my voice calm and rational. Okay, here's what we're going to do. Pack a bag. I'll be there in an hour to pick you up. We're getting out of here. And go where? Sam asked, desperation clear in his voice. I hesitated, then made a decision. Dr. Forrester. He believes us and he knows more about these creatures than anyone. If anyone can help us, it's him. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Finally, Sam spoke, his voice small and vulnerable in a way I'd never heard before. Okay. Yeah, okay. Just hurry, Em. Please. As I hung up and rushed to throw some clothes into a duffel bag, my mind whirled with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Had the creature really followed us all this way? Was it seeking revenge for our escape? Or was this all just a product of our traumatized minds, seeing threats where none existed? I didn't know. But as I grabbed my keys and headed for the door, one thing was crystal clear. The aftermath of our encounter in the Blue Mountains was far from over. The familiar scent of pine and damp earth filled my nostrils as I stepped out of my rental car, the gravel of the trailhead parking lot crunching beneath my boots. The Blue Mountains loomed before me, their peaks shrouded in early morning mist, just as they had been on that fateful day nearly a year ago. A shiver ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the crisp autumn air. This is insane, I muttered to myself, shouldering my backpack. What the hell am I doing here? It was a question I'd asked myself repeatedly over the past week, ever since I'd made the impulsive decision to return to the scene of our nightmare. Sam had been furious when I told him my plan. Are you out of your mind? He'd yelled, his face pale with a mixture of anger and fear. After everything we went through, you want to go back there? Alone? I'd tried to explain my reasoning, though I knew it sounded weak even to my own ears. We need proof, Sam. Real tangible evidence. If I can just get a clear photo or find some tracks. It's not worth the risk, Sam had insisted, grabbing my arm. Please, Em, don't do this. But in the end, he couldn't stop me. The pull of potential answers, of validation, was too strong to resist. And so here I was, standing at the edge of the forest that had nearly claimed our lives, about to willingly walk back into the lion's den. I took a deep breath, steeling my nerves. Okay, Emily, you can do this. Just stick to the plan. In and out in 3 days. No heroics, no unnecessary risks. With one last glance at my car and the relative safety it represented, I set off down the trail. The first few hours of hiking were uneventful. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and small animals, the sunlight filtering through the canopy creating dappled patterns on the forest floor. If I didn't know better, I might have thought it was just another beautiful day in the wilderness. But I did know better. Every shadow held the potential for danger. Every rustle in the undergrowth sent my heart racing. I found myself constantly scanning my surroundings, my hand never far from the canister of bear spray on my hip. Not that it would do much good against what I was truly afraid of encountering. As I hiked, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was watching me. It was as if the very trees held their breath, waiting to see what I would do. The silence between bird calls seemed to stretch longer than it should, the shadows a little darker than natural. "Get a grip," I muttered to myself. "You're letting your imagination run wild." But even as I said it, I couldn't quite convince myself it was true. Around midday, I came to a small clearing that made my blood run cold. It was here, or somewhere very like it, that we had first seen the footprint, the massive, human-like track that had been our first real indication that something was terribly wrong. I scanned the soft earth near the stream, half hoping and half dreading to see a similar print. But the ground was unmarked save for the small tracks of deer and raccoons. I wasn't sure if I was relieved or disappointed. As I paused to eat a quick lunch, I pulled out my journal and made some notes. I'd decided to document everything on this trip, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. If I was going to risk my life coming back here, I was damn well going to make it count. Day 1, I wrote. No sign yet of unusual activity. Forest seems normal, but can't shake feeling of being watched. Weather clear, temp mild. We'll set up camp about 2 miles further in, near site of original encounter. I hesitated, then added, still questioning sanity of this endeavor. Tucking the journal away, I shouldered my pack and continued on. As the afternoon wore on, the trail began to look more and more familiar. Every turn, every distinctive tree or rock formation brought back flashes of that terrible night. I could almost hear Sam's panicked breathing, feel the burn in my legs as we ran for our lives. Finally, as the sun began to dip towards the horizon, I reached the area where we had made our ill-fated camp a year ago. My heart was pounding as I scanned the clearing, half expecting to see the tattered remains of our tent or the scattered contents of our backpacks. But there was nothing. No sign that anything out of the ordinary had ever happened here. "Okay," I said aloud, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet forest. "This is as good a place as any to set up camp." I went through the motions of setting up my tent and preparing a small fire, all the while keeping a watchful eye on my surroundings. As darkness fell, the forest seemed to close in around me. The friendly chirping of birds was replaced by the eerie hoots of owls and the rustle of nocturnal creatures. Sitting by my small fire, I pulled out my journal again. Night 1, I wrote. Camp established near original encounter site. No signs of disturbance or unusual activity. However, atmosphere feels oppressive. Hard to shake feeling of being observed. A twig snapped in the darkness beyond my fire's light, causing me to jump. I shone my flashlight in the direction of the sound, but saw nothing but trees and shadows. Still, it took several minutes for my heart rate to return to normal. Nighttime sounds more unsettling than anticipated, I added to my journal entry, questioning wisdom of this expedition, but committed now, will continue as planned. As I crawled into my tent that night, I couldn't help but remember the terror of our last night in these woods, the inhuman howl that had echoed through the mountains, the massive shape that had circled our camp. I clutched my sleeping bag tightly around me, straining my ears for any sound out of the ordinary. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and filled with nightmares. I awoke with a start, disoriented in the pre-dawn gloom. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was or why I was there. Then it all came rushing back, and with it a renewed sense of purpose. After a quick breakfast of granola bars and instant coffee, I set out to explore the area around my camp. I moved slowly, carefully examining the ground for any signs of large tracks or disturbances in the undergrowth. My camera hung ready around my neck, and I had my phone out to record any potential evidence. Hours passed with no results. The forest remained stubbornly, maddeningly normal. By mid-afternoon, frustration had begun to set in. "This is useless," I muttered, kicking at a pile of leaves. What did I expect? That BigFoot would just be waiting for me, posing for pictures? I was about to head back to camp when a flash of color caught my eye. Nestled in the bark of a nearby tree was a tuft of fur, reddish-brown and coarser than any animal hair I'd ever seen. My heart began to race as I carefully extracted it from the tree. "Oh my God," I whispered, holding it up to the light. "This could be it. This could be the proof we need." With shaking hands, I placed the fur sample in a small plastic bag, then snapped several photos of where I'd found it. I marked the location on my GPS and made detailed notes in my journal. Day 2, I wrote, found unusual hair sample approx. 500 meters northwest of camp. Texture and color unlike any known local wildlife. Possible proof of creature's existence? The discovery reinvigorated me. I spent the rest of the day combing the area for more evidence but found nothing else out of the ordinary. Still, as I returned to camp that evening, I felt a sense of accomplishment. Maybe this trip wasn't so crazy after all. That night, as I sat by my fire reviewing the day's findings, a sound echoed through the mountains that made my blood run cold. It was a roar, distant but unmistakable. The same bone-chilling sound we'd heard a year ago. I scrambled for my camera, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold it steady. The roar came again, closer this time. I fumbled with the settings, trying to switch to video mode, but my fingers felt clumsy and uncooperative. Come on, I muttered, finally managing to hit the record button. For several long moments there was nothing but the sound of my own ragged breathing. Then, just as I was about to give up, the roar echoed through the night once more. This time I caught it on video. Holy shit, I breathed, rewatching the clip. The sound was clear, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't a bear, wasn't a wolf, wasn't any animal I could identify. This, combined with the hair sample, could be the evidence we'd been searching for. But my elation was short-lived. As the implications of what I'd just heard sank in, a new wave of terror washed over me. The creature was out there. It was real, and it was close. I doused my fire and retreated to my tent, zipping it up tightly as if the thin fabric could offer any real protection. Outside, the forest had gone unnaturally quiet. No owls hooted, no small animals rustled in the underbrush. It was as if the entire ecosystem was holding its breath, waiting. I huddled in my sleeping bag, clutching my bear spray in one hand and my phone in the other. Every sound, every shift of shadow outside the tent sent my heart racing. I was acutely aware of how vulnerable I was, how foolish I'd been to come out here alone. Sam was right, I whispered to myself. This was a mistake. I should never have come back here. But it was too late for regrets now. I was here, and something else was out there. All I could do was wait and hope to survive the night. Hours crawled by, each minute stretching into an eternity. I dozed fitfully, jerking awake at the slightest sound. Once I could have sworn I heard heavy footsteps circling my tent, but when I shone my flashlight outside, there was nothing there. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the tent fabric, I realized with a mix of relief and disappointment that I'd survived the night without incident. Part of me was grateful, of course, but another part, the part that had driven me to return to these mountains, felt cheated. I'd come so close to a real encounter, only to have it slip away with the night. I emerged from my tent cautiously, scanning the area for any signs of disturbance. The clearing looked exactly as it had the night before. No massive footprints, no broken branches, nothing to indicate that anything out of the ordinary had happened. With a sigh, I set about breaking camp. It was the last day of my planned expedition, and while I'd found some potential evidence, it wasn't the irrefutable proof I'd hoped for. As I packed up my gear, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was giving up too soon. Maybe I should stay one more night, I mused aloud. Push a little further into the mountains. It was so close last night I can feel it. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew it was a bad idea. I'd already taken an enormous risk coming out here alone. Pushing my luck any further would be foolish at best, suicidal at worst. With one last look around the clearing, I shouldered my pack and began the long hike back to civilization. The forest seemed different now, more alive somehow. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every shadow between the trees, held the potential for something. I found myself jumping at small sounds, my hand never far from the bear spray on my hip. About an hour into my hike, I paused to check my map and take a drink of water. As I was tucking the map back into my pocket, a flash of movement caught my eye. I froze, hardly daring to breathe as I scanned the forest around me. There, between two massive pines about 50 yards away, was a dark shape, larger than a man covered in reddish-brown fur. For a moment our eyes met. Its gaze was intelligent, almost curious. Then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone, melting into the shadows of the forest as if it had never been there at all. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. With trembling hands I pulled out my camera, but I knew it was too late. The creature, BigFoot, Sasquatch, whatever you wanted to call it, was gone. Did that really just happen? I whispered to myself, still staring at the spot where I'd seen the creature. Part of me wanted to follow it, to plunge into the depths of the forest in pursuit of the truth I'd come here seeking. But a stronger, more rational part knew that would be suicide. Instead, I carefully documented the sighting in my journal, noting the exact time and location. Then, with a renewed sense of urgency, I continued my hike back to the trailhead. The weight of what I'd seen, what I thought I'd seen, pressed down on me, making each step feel like a mile. As I finally emerged from the forest into the parking lot where my rental car waited, a wave of emotions washed over me. Relief at having made it out safely, excitement at the evidence I'd gathered, and a deep, unsettling feeling that this was far from over. I tossed my pack into the trunk and slid behind the wheel, my hands shaking slightly as I turned the key in the ignition. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I couldn't resist one last glance in the rearview mirror at the forest behind me. For just a moment, I could have sworn I saw a large, dark shape standing at the edge of the trees, watching me leave. But I blinked, and it was gone. The drive back to civilization was a blur. My mind raced with the implications of what I'd experienced, what I'd potentially discovered. The hair sample, the recorded roar, the fleeting glimpse of the creature itself. It was more than we'd ever had before. But would it be enough? As soon as I had cell service again, I called Sam. He answered on the first ring, his voice tight with worry. "Em, are you okay? Where are you?" "I'm fine," I assured him quickly. "I'm on my way back now. Sam, you won't believe what happened." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Sam spoke again, his voice was carefully controlled. "What did you see, Em?" I took a deep breath, then launched into a detailed account of my expedition. The oppressive atmosphere of the forest, the hair sample, the roar in the night, and finally, the glimpse of the creature itself. Sam listened in silence, not interrupting once. When I finished, the silence stretched on so long I thought we'd lost the connection. "Sam? You still there?" "Yeah," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm here. I don't know what to say." "Say you believe me," I pleaded. "Say this is the proof we've been looking for." Another long pause. "I believe you saw something," he said carefully. "But we've been down this road before. Blurry photos, inconclusive sound recordings. It's never enough. You know that." His words stung, but I knew he had a point. "This is different," I insisted. "I have the hair sample, and the video of the roar. It's clear as day, Sam. This could be it. This could be what makes people finally believe us." Sam sighed heavily. "Maybe. But at what cost, Em? You could have been killed out there. Was it really worth the risk?" I thought about the terror of that night in my tent, the heart-stopping moment when I'd locked eyes with the creature. Had it been worth it? I wasn't sure. But I knew I couldn't have lived with myself if I hadn't tried. "I had to do it," I said softly. "I had to know." "I know," Sam replied, his voice gentler now. "Just come home safe, okay? We'll figure out what to do next together." As I hung up, I felt a mix of emotions washing over me. Relief at having survived my return to the Blue Mountains. Excitement at the potential evidence I'd gathered. but also a deep, unsettling feeling that this was far from over. The creature was out there. I'd seen it with my own eyes, heard its bone-chilling roar echo through the night. And now that I knew for certain it was real, I couldn't just walk away. The need for answers, for validation, burned stronger than ever. But as I drove through the gathering darkness, the mountains looming in my rearview mirror, a chill ran down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that by returning to those woods, by seeking out the truth, I'd set something in motion, something that wouldn't easily be stopped. The creature had seen me too. It knew I was looking for it. And somehow, deep in my bones, I knew this wasn't the end of our encounter. It was just the beginning. As the lights of the nearest town came into view, I made a silent vow. The relentless ticking of the wall clock seemed to mock me as I sat at my kitchen table, staring blankly at the pile of newspaper clippings and blurry photographs spread out before me. 6 months had passed since that terrifying night in the Blue Mountains, but the memories still haunted me like a persistent shadow. I rubbed my eyes, feeling the familiar ache of exhaustion settling into my bones. Sleep had become a luxury I could rarely afford, my nights plagued by vivid nightmares of matted fur, yellowed fangs, and my brother's agonized screams. "You're obsessing again, aren't you?" Sarah's voice startled me from my thoughts. I looked up to see my girlfriend leaning against the doorframe, her expression a mixture of concern and exasperation. I sighed, pushing away from the table. "I'm not obsessing. I'm researching." Sarah raised an eyebrow, crossing the room to examine the scattered papers. "Researching what exactly? How to drive yourself crazy?" "You don't understand," I muttered, feeling a familiar defensiveness rising in my chest. "What happened to us out there? It was real. I know it was." Sarah's face softened as she placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "I believe that you believe it was real. But honey, it's been months. Don't you think it's time to let this go?" I shrugged off her touch, frustration bubbling up inside me. Let it go? How am I supposed to just let go of something like that? You weren't there, Sarah. You didn't see what that thing did to Sam. At the mention of my brother's name, Sarah's expression tightened. "Have you talked to Sam recently?" I looked away, guilt gnawing at my insides. Not really. He doesn't want to talk about it." "Can you blame him?" Sarah asked softly. "Maybe he's trying to move on. Maybe that's what you should be doing too." Her words struck a nerve, and I found myself lashing out. "Move on? How can I move on when no one believes us? When everyone thinks we're either lying or crazy?" Sarah took a step back, hurt flashing in her eyes. "I'm not saying I don't believe you, I'm just worried about you. This obsession isn't healthy." "It's not an obsession," I snapped, even as a small voice in the back of my mind whispered that maybe she was right. "I need answers, Sarah. I need to understand what happened to us out there." Sarah shook her head, a hint of resignation in her voice. "I don't think you're going to find the answers you're looking for in old newspaper clippings and grainy photos." As she turned to leave the room, I felt a pang of regret. "Sarah, wait. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." But she was already gone, leaving me alone with my scattered research and the growing weight of doubt pressing down on my shoulders. I slumped back into my chair, running a hand through my unkempt hair. Maybe Sarah was right. Maybe I was obsessing. But how could I not? The memory of that night was etched into my mind with terrifying clarity. The stench of wet fur and rotting meat, the inhuman strength as the creature tossed Sam aside like a rag doll, the bone-chilling roar that seemed to shake the very mountains. And yet, as the months had passed, I'd begun to question my own memories. The human mind is a tricky thing, capable of distorting reality in times of extreme stress. Could it be possible that what I remembered wasn't exactly what had happened? I reached for my phone, my finger hovering over Sam's contact information. We'd barely spoken since that night, the shared trauma driving a wedge between us that seemed to grow wider with each passing day. Part of me ached to talk to him, to compare our memories and reassure myself that I wasn't going crazy. But another part of me feared what I might learn if we did talk. With a frustrated groan, I tossed the phone aside and buried my face in my hands. The doubts that had been creeping into my mind over the past few months seemed to swirl around me like a fog, obscuring the truth I'd been so certain of in the immediate aftermath of the attack. A sharp knock at the door jolted me from my brooding. Grateful for the distraction, I pushed myself to my feet and made my way to the front of the house. I opened the door to find a man in his mid-50s standing on my porch, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed and a polite smile on his face. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice carrying a hint of a southern drawl. "My name is Dr. Ethan Holbrook. I was hoping I might have a word with you about your experience in the Blue Mountains." I felt my body tense, immediately on guard. "How did you know about that?" Dr. Holbrook's smile never wavered. "May I come in? I think you'll find what I have to say quite interesting." Against my better judgment, I stepped aside to let him enter. As he passed, I caught a whiff of cologne mixed with the musty scent of old books. "I appreciate you taking the time to speak with me," Dr. Holbrook said, as he settled into an armchair in my living room. "I know you've likely grown tired of people questioning your story." I remained standing, my arms crossed defensively over my chest. "You still haven't told me how you know about what happened to us." Dr. Holbrook nodded, reaching into his briefcase to pull out a well-worn leather notebook. "I'm a cryptozoologist. I study animals whose existence has yet to be proven by science. Your encounter with what you believe to be a Sasquatch, or BigFoot as it's more commonly known, has caused quite a stir in certain circles." I felt a flicker of hope ignite in my chest. You believe us?" The older man's expression turned serious. "I believe that you and your brother experienced something traumatic and unexplainable in those mountains. Whether it was actually a Bigfoot, well, that's what I'm here to discuss." My hope dimmed slightly, but I found myself sinking into the couch across from Dr. Holbrook. "What exactly do you want to know?" For the next hour, I recounted every detail I could remember about that night. The massive footprints we'd discovered, the inhuman howl that had echoed through the mountains, the terrifying strength of the creature as it attacked Sam. Dr. Holbrook listened intently, occasionally jotting notes in his leather-bound book. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Thank you for sharing that with me. I can only imagine how difficult it must be to relive those memories." I nodded, feeling emotionally drained. Do you think it really was a Bigfoot?" Dr. Holbrook was quiet for a moment before responding. "In my years of research, I've heard countless stories of Bigfoot encounters. Some are obvious hoaxes, others are simply cases of misidentification. But every once in a while I come across an account that makes me wonder." He trailed off, and I found myself leaning forward, eager for validation. "So you do believe us?" The cryptozoologist's eyes met mine, his gaze penetrating. "I believe that you experienced something extraordinary that night. But I also know that human memory is fallible, especially in high-stress situations." I felt my heart sink. "You think we imagined it?" "Not necessarily," Dr. Holbrook said carefully. "But it's possible that your mind has filled in certain details or exaggerated others in the months since the attack. It's a natural coping mechanism." I stood up abruptly, anger flaring in my chest. "We didn't imagine it. That thing was real. It nearly killed my brother." Dr. Holbrook held up his hands in a placating gesture. "I'm not saying it wasn't real. I'm simply suggesting that we approach your memories with a critical eye. Would you be willing to undergo hypnosis? It might help us uncover details you've forgotten or clarify aspects of the encounter." I hesitated, torn between my desire for answers and my fear of what those answers might reveal. I don't know. I need to think about it." The older man nodded, reaching into his pocket to produce a business card. "Of course. Take all the time you need. If you decide you'd like to explore this further, please don't hesitate to contact me." As I showed Dr. Holbrook out, my mind was reeling. Part of me wanted to believe that he could help me make sense of what had happened that night. But another part of me feared that pursuing this further would only lead to more doubt and confusion. I spent the rest of the evening in a daze, Dr. Holbrook's words echoing in my mind. The possibility that my memories might not be entirely accurate was both terrifying and oddly comforting. If I couldn't trust my own recollection of events, then maybe... My phone buzzed, startling me from my thoughts. I glanced at the screen to see a text from Sarah. "I'm sorry about earlier. I know this is important to you. Maybe we could talk about it over dinner tomorrow." I felt a pang of guilt as I remembered our argument. Sarah had been nothing but supportive throughout this ordeal, even when my obsession had pushed her to her limits. I quickly typed out a response. "I'm sorry too. Dinner sounds great. There's actually something I want to talk to you about." As I hit send, I realized that I'd made my decision. I would take Dr. Holbrook up on his offer of hypnosis. Whatever the truth was, I needed to face it head on. The next evening, Sarah and I sat across from each other at our favorite Italian restaurant, the tension from our earlier argument still lingering in the air between us. "So," Sarah said, twirling pasta around her fork, "you said there was something you wanted to talk about?" I took a deep breath, steeling myself for her reaction. "Yeah. A man came to see me yesterday. A cryptozoologist named Dr. Holbrook. He wants to hypnotize me to see if we can uncover more details about what happened that night in the mountains." Sarah's fork clattered against her plate. "Hypnotize you? Are you serious?" I nodded, feeling a mix of apprehension and determination. "I know it sounds crazy, but I think it might help. Maybe it'll give me the answers I need to finally move on." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she reached across the table to take my hand. "If this is really what you want to do, I'll support you. But promise me you'll be careful. I don't want you getting hurt again." I squeezed her hand, feeling a rush of gratitude for her understanding. "I promise, and thank you for everything." The next few days passed in a blur of anticipation and anxiety. I'd called Dr. Holbrook to set up an appointment, and now, as I sat in the waiting room of his office, I found myself second-guessing my decision. The door opened and Dr. Holbrook emerged, greeting me with a warm smile. "Are you ready?" he asked. I nodded, my mouth suddenly dry. "As ready as I'll ever be." He led me into a comfortably furnished room, gesturing for me to lie down on a plush recliner. "Now, I want you to understand that hypnosis isn't like what you see in the movies," Dr. Holbrook explained as he settled into a chair beside me. "You won't be unconscious, and I won't be able to make you do anything you don't want to do. Think of it more as a state of deep relaxation that allows us to access memories more clearly." I nodded, trying to calm my racing heart. "Okay, let's do this." "Doctor," Holbrook's voice took on a soothing cadence as he guided me through a series of relaxation exercises. Gradually, I felt the tension leave my body, my eyelids growing heavy as I slipped into a trance-like state. "Now," Dr. Holbrook's voice seemed to come from far away, "I want you to think back to that night in the Blue Mountains. You're hiking with your brother Sam. What do you see?" Suddenly, I was there again, the crisp mountain air filling my lungs as Sam and I made our way along the trail. "It's getting dark," I heard myself say. "We should make camp soon." Sam nodded, his face etched with excitement. "This spot looks good. Did you hear that weird noise earlier? Almost sounded like..." A bone-chilling howl cut through the air, causing both of us to freeze in our tracks. "What the hell was that?" Sam whispered, his eyes wide with fear. Before I could respond, a massive shape burst from the underbrush, barreling towards us with terrifying speed. "Run!" I screamed, grabbing Sam's arm and pulling him along as we fled deeper into the forest. The memory seemed to fracture then, images flashing by in a chaotic blur. The stench of wet fur and rotting meat, glowing eyes in the darkness. Sam's body flying through the air as the creature struck him. "It's okay," Dr. Holbrook's voice cut through the panic. "You're safe. Take a deep breath and try to focus on the details." "What does the creature look like?" I struggled to bring the image into focus, fighting against the fear that threatened to overwhelm me. It's big. Bigger than any animal I've ever seen. Covered in dark, matted fur. But its face." "Yes?" Dr. Holbrook prompted gently. "What about its face?" I frowned, confusion seeping into my voice. I can't see it clearly. It's like it's blurred somehow." "That's all right," the cryptozoologist assured me. "Let's move on." What happened next? The scene shifted, and suddenly I was watching helplessly as the creature dragged Sam into the darkness. "No!" I heard myself scream, grabbing a fallen branch and swinging it with all my might. But as the branch connected, something strange happened. Instead of the solid impact I remembered, it seemed to pass right through the creature, as if it were made of smoke. That's not right," I muttered, feeling a sense of disorientation. "That's not how it happened." Dr. Holbrook's voice was calm and steady. "Remember, our minds can sometimes alter memories, especially traumatic ones. Just focus on what you're seeing now." The scene continued to play out, but now everything seemed slightly off. The creature's movements were jerky and unnatural, like a poorly animated special effect. Sam's scream sounded distorted, almost mechanical. As we finally escaped the forest, breaking through the tree line into an open field, I felt a surge of relief. But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Our shadows cast by the light of the full moon were all wrong. Mine was distorted, stretching impossibly long, while Sam's was missing entirely. "This isn't real," I heard myself say, panic rising in my chest. "None of this is real." Suddenly I was jolted back to awareness, sitting up in the recliner with a gasp. Dr. Holbrook was leaning forward, concern etched on his face. "Are you all right?" he asked, offering me a glass of water. I took it with shaking hands, my mind reeling. I don't understand. What happened?" Dr. Holbrook sat back, his expression thoughtful. "It's not uncommon for memories to become distorted under hypnosis, especially when dealing with traumatic events. Your mind may be trying to protect you from the full impact of what happened." I shook my head, frustration building inside me. But it felt so real when it was happening. And now I don't know what to believe. The cryptozoologist was quiet for a moment before speaking. "The human mind is incredibly complex. It's possible that your original memories have become intertwined with your fears, doubts, and the stories you've heard since that night." I slumped back in the chair, feeling utterly lost. "So what does that mean? Was any of it real?" Dr. Holbrook leaned forward, his eyes meeting mine. "I can't answer that for you, but I can tell you that whatever happened that night, the fear and trauma you experienced were very real. Perhaps focusing on healing from that trauma is more important than uncovering every detail of what occurred." As I left Dr. Holbrook's office, my mind was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts and emotions. The hypnosis session had left me with more questions than answers, and the doubt that had been gnawing at me for months now seemed to consume my every waking moment. Over the next few weeks, I found myself withdrawing from friends and family, spending hours poring over my research and trying to make sense of my fragmented memories. Sarah's concerned looks and gentle prodding did little to pull me out of my spiral. The crisp autumn air bit at Sarah's cheeks as she trudged through the dense forest, her boots crunching on fallen leaves. It had been 5 years since that fateful night, yet the memories still haunted her like a persistent shadow. She paused, her eyes instinctively scanning the tree line, searching for any sign of movement. "You're doing it again," Sam's voice broke through her thoughts. Sarah turned to face her husband, forcing a smile. "Old habits die hard, I guess." Sam's face softened as he reached out to squeeze her hand. "I know, but we're safe now. It's just a camping trip, remember?" Sarah nodded, trying to push away the nagging feeling of dread that had settled in her stomach. They had promised each other they would move on, to reclaim their love for the outdoors and not let fear dictate their lives. But standing here, surrounded by towering pines and the eerie silence of the forest, Sarah couldn't help but feel like they were tempting fate. "Let's set up camp before it gets dark," Sam suggested, his voice gentle but firm. As they worked to pitch their tent, Sarah's mind wandered back to that night 5 years ago. The memories came in flashes, the bone-chilling howl, the glowing eyes in the darkness, the feeling of utter helplessness as they ran for their lives. She shook her head, trying to dispel the images. "Hey." Sam's voice pulled her back to the present. "Where'd you go just now?" Sarah sighed, sitting down on a nearby log. "I was just remembering. I know we agreed not to talk about it, but sometimes I can't help it. Being out here, it all feels so familiar." Sam sat beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "I know. I think about it too, more than I'd like to admit. But we can't let it control us forever, Sarah. We survived. We're here. That's what matters." Sarah leaned into him, drawing comfort from his presence. "You're right. I wish we knew for sure what happened that night. What we saw." Sam was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant. "Maybe not knowing is better. I mean, if we knew for certain what was out there." His voice trailed off, leaving the implications hanging in the air. Sarah nodded, understanding. The uncertainty, as maddening as it could be, was also a kind of protection. It allowed them to rationalize, to tell themselves that perhaps their minds had played tricks on them that night. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, Sarah and Sam finished setting up their campsite. They sat around a small fire, the flames casting a warm glow on their faces. "Remember our first camping trip together?" Sam asked, a hint of nostalgia in his voice. Sarah smiled, genuinely this time. "How could I forget? You insisted you knew how to start a fire without matches, and we ended up eating cold beans straight from the can." They both laughed, the sound echoing through the quiet forest. For a moment Sarah felt a sense of normalcy, of peace. But as night fell and the forest grew darker, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. "I'm going to get some more firewood," Sam said, standing up. "Want to come with me?" Sarah hesitated, glancing at the darkening woods. I think I'll stay here. Keep the fire going." Sam nodded, understanding in his eyes. He leaned down to kiss her forehead before grabbing a flashlight and heading into the trees. Alone by the fire, Sarah hugged her knees to her chest, trying to focus on the crackling flames rather than the oppressive darkness surrounding her. She tried to remind herself that they were safe, that what happened 5 years ago was a one-time occurrence. But as the minutes ticked by and Sam didn't return, a familiar panic began to rise in her chest. "Sam," she called out, her voice sounding small in the vast wilderness. "Sam, are you there?" No response came. Sarah stood up, her heart racing. She grabbed her own flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness as she scanned the trees. "Sam!" she called again, louder this time. "Sam, answer me!" A twig snapped somewhere in the darkness, and Sarah whirled around, her flashlight beam dancing wildly across the forest floor. She could hear her own ragged breathing, loud in the eerie silence. And then, faintly at first, but growing louder, she heard it. A howl. Low and mournful, it echoed through the trees, sending a chill down Sarah's spine. It was a sound she had hoped never to hear again, a sound that had haunted her nightmares for years. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "No, not again. Please, not again." As if in response, another howl pierced the night, closer this time. Sarah's instincts screamed at her to run, but her feet seemed rooted to the spot. She was paralyzed by fear, memories of that night 5 years ago, flooding back with terrifying clarity. "Sam!" she screamed, desperation in her voice. "Sam, where are you?" The forest seemed to come alive around her, shadows moving in the periphery of her vision. Sarah spun in circles, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, searching for any sign of Sam or the source of those bone-chilling howls. And then, emerging from the shadows, she saw them. A pair of glowing eyes, fixed directly on her. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. As she stood there, frozen in terror, a realization slowly dawned on her. This was it, the moment of truth. After years of uncertainty, of questioning their memories and experiences, she was face to face with the thing that had haunted them for so long. Part 2. The Confrontation. Sarah's mind raced, torn between the overwhelming urge to flee and the desperate need to find Sam. The glowing eyes remained fixed on her, unblinking and unmoving. In that moment, Sarah made a decision. She was tired of running, tired of living in fear. Whatever this thing was, whatever had happened that night 5 years ago, she needed answers. With trembling hands, she raised her flashlight, pointing it directly at the source of those haunting eyes. The beam illuminated a figure that seemed to defy description. It was vaguely humanoid, but larger, its body covered in dark, matted fur. Its face was a nightmarish blend of human and animal features, with a protruding snout and razor-sharp teeth visible in its slightly open mouth. Sarah's breath came in short, panicked gasps, but she stood her ground. "What are you?" she managed to choke out, her voice barely above a whisper. The creature tilted its head in unsettlingly human gesture. For a long moment it simply stared at her, as if considering her question. Then, to Sarah's utter shock, it spoke. "We are the Forgotten." The creature's voice was low and guttural, each word seeming to cause it pain. The in-between, neither fully human, nor fully beast. Sarah's mind reeled. She had expected many things, but not this. Not a conversation with the very thing that had terrorized her for years. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice growing stronger. "Why did you attack us that night?" The creature's eyes seemed to flash with something akin to sorrow. "Attack? No. Protect. Warn. You entered our territory, our sanctuary. We had to drive you away." Sarah's brow furrowed in confusion. "Protect? But you chased us, you killed our friend." The creature shook its massive head slowly. "No kill. Frighten. Your friend. Accident. He fell. We do not hunt humans. We hide from them." A cold realization washed over Sarah. All these years they had believed they were hunted, attacked by some monstrous predator. But if what this creature was saying was true... "Why are you telling me this now?" Sarah asked, her mind struggling to process this new information. The creature took a step closer, and Sarah had to fight every instinct not to back away. "Because you came back," it growled. "Because you face us now with courage, you deserve truth." Sarah's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. She turned to see Sam bursting through the trees, his face pale with worry. "Sarah, I heard you screaming, His voice trailed off as he saw the creature. His eyes widened in disbelief and fear. "Oh my God." "Sam, wait," Sarah said, reaching out to stop him as he moved to stand in front of her protectively. "It's okay, it's talking to us." Sam looked at her as if she had lost her mind. "Talking? Sarah, what are you—" But before he could finish, the creature spoke again, causing Sam to stumble back in shock. "We mean no harm," it growled. "We only wish to be left in peace." Sam's mouth opened and closed, no words coming out. He looked to Sarah, confusion and fear evident in his eyes. "It's telling us the truth about that night," Sarah explained quickly, "about what really happened." Over the next hour, as the fire burned low and the forest around them remained eerily silent, the creature told its story. It spoke of a hidden society, neither fully human nor animal, living in the remote wilderness. They were the result of ancient rituals and curses, forced to live on the fringes of both worlds, always hiding, always afraid of discovery. "We protect our own," the creature explained. When humans come too close, we scare them away. That night, we went too far. We are sorry for your friend." Sarah and Sam listened in stunned silence, their worldview shifting dramatically with each word. The terror of that night, the years of fear and uncertainty that followed, all of it was being rewritten. "Why tell us this now?" Sam finally asked, his voice hoarse. "Why not just chase us away again?" The creature's eyes seemed to soften, if that was possible for such a fearsome visage. "Because you came back. You faced your fear. Few humans have such courage. We hope understanding brings peace. For you. For us." As the creature finished its tale, a heavy silence fell over the clearing. Sarah and Sam exchanged glances, a wordless communication passing between them. After years of running from their memories, of questioning their sanity, they were finally face to face with the truth. It wasn't what they had expected, but in a strange way it brought a sense of closure. "What now?" Sarah asked, looking back at the creature. "What happens after this?" The creature straightened to its full height, towering over them. "Now you choose. Stay, learn more, or go, keep our secret. But no more fear, no more running." Sam took Sarah's hand, squeezing it gently. "What do you think?" he asked softly. Sarah took a deep breath, looking from Sam to the creature and back again. This was a turning point, she realized. A chance to face their fears head-on, to find answers to questions that had plagued them for years. But it was also dangerous, stepping into an unknown world that defied everything they thought they knew. "I think," she said slowly, "that we've spent too long running from our past. Maybe it's time we faced it." Sam nodded, a mix of fear and determination in his eyes. "Together?" Sarah smiled, feeling a sense of peace wash over her for the first time in years. "Together." They turned back to the creature, who had been watching their exchange with what seemed like curiosity. "We'll stay," Sarah said firmly. "We want to understand, to learn." The creature nodded solemnly. "Then follow. There is much to show you." As they gathered their belongings and prepared to follow the creature deeper into the forest, Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The acceptance of their new reality, as strange and terrifying as it was, brought with it a sense of freedom. No more looking over their shoulders. No more sleepless nights wondering what lurked in the shadows. They were about to embark on a journey into the unknown. But for the first time in years, Sarah felt ready to face whatever lay ahead. With Sam by her side and the truth finally revealed, she took her first steps towards a new chapter in their lives. Part 3. The Hidden World. As they followed the creature deeper into the forest, Sarah and Sam found themselves in a world that seemed to exist between reality and fantasy. The trees grew denser, their branches intertwining overhead to create a natural canopy that blocked out most of the moonlight. The air grew thick with an earthy primordial scent, and strange bioluminescent fungi cast an eerie glow along the forest floor. "Watch your step," the creature growled, its massive form easily navigating the treacherous terrain. "The path is not meant for human feet." Sarah and Sam picked their way carefully over gnarled roots and moss-covered rocks, their flashlights revealing glimpses of an ecosystem unlike anything they had ever seen. Unusual plants with leaves that seemed to pulse with an inner light lined the path, and in the distance, they could hear the calls of animals that didn't quite sound natural. "What is this place?" Sam asked, his voice hushed with awe and a hint of fear. The creature paused, turning its massive head to regard them. "This is the border between your world and ours. The veil grows thin here. Magic seeps through." "Magic?" Sarah repeated, disbelief evident in her tone. "You mean actual magic?" The creature's mouth twisted into what might have been a smile, though on its fearsome visage, the expression was more terrifying than reassuring. "Your kind has forgotten the old ways, the true nature of the world. Here, we remember. We live it." As they continued their journey, Sarah and Sam began to notice shapes moving in the shadows around them. Glowing eyes peered out from behind trees, and occasionally they caught glimpses of figures that seemed to flicker between human and animal forms. "Are those others like you?" Sam asked, his grip tightening on Sarah's hand. The creature nodded. "My people. Cursed, blessed, depending on how you see it. We are many, but we remain hidden. Humans fear what they do not understand." Sarah felt a pang of guilt at those words, remembering the terror she had felt at the mere thought of these beings for so many years. "We're sorry," she said softly. "We didn't know." The creature turned to her, its eyes softening slightly. "Fear is natural, but understanding, that is a choice. You have chosen to understand. That is why you are here now." As they walked, the creature began to explain more about its people. They called themselves the Shifters, beings caught between the human and animal worlds. Their origins were shrouded in mystery, but they believed themselves to be the result of ancient rituals gone awry, or perhaps the offspring of unions between humans and primordial forest spirits. "We have lived in these forests for centuries," the creature explained. "Hiding, adapting, surviving. We have seen empires rise and fall, seen humans push further and further into our lands. But we endure." "How have you remained hidden for so long?" Sam asked, fascination overtaking his fear. The creature gestured to the strange glowing plants around them. "The forest protects us. Our magic and its magic are one. It hides us from prying eyes, confuses those who wander too close. Your technology fails here. Your compasses spin, your maps become useless." Sarah and Sam exchanged glances, suddenly understanding why their GPS had been so unreliable on their ill-fated camping trip 5 years ago. As they walked, the forest around them seemed to come alive. The trees appeared to shift and move, creating a path where none had existed before. Strange, ethereal music drifted on the breeze, a haunting melody that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "We're nearing the heart of our territory," the creature announced. "Prepare yourselves. What you are about to see may challenge everything you believe about the world." With those ominous words, they stepped into a clearing that took their breath away. Before them stood an entire village, but unlike any they had ever seen. The structures were a seamless blend of natural and crafted elements. Houses were grown rather than built, their walls formed from living trees that had been coaxed and shaped over decades. Bridges of twisted vines connected tree houses high above the ground, and everywhere there was light, not from electricity, but from the same bioluminescent plants they had seen along the path, cultivated and shaped to provide illumination. But it was the inhabitants that truly caught Sarah and Sam's attention. Beings of all shapes and sizes moved about the village. Some appeared almost human, save for subtle animal features, pointed ears, eyes that reflected light like a cat's, patches of fur or scales. Others were more like their guide, massive and bestial, yet moving with an unmistakable intelligence. And some seemed to flicker between forms, their bodies fluid and ever-changing. "Welcome," the creature said, its voice tinged with pride, "to Shadowhaven." The old Jeep Cherokee groaned as Jason Wilson navigated the winding mountain road, its headlights cutting through the thickening fog. Sarah Martinez, his longtime friend and camping buddy, sat in the passenger seat, her face illuminated by the glow of her smartphone. "You sure about this place, Jace?" Sarah asked, looking up from her device. "The reviews are pretty mixed. Some people swear it's the best camping in the Poconos, others say it's too remote." Jason grinned, his eyes never leaving the road. "That's exactly why I picked it. We've done the touristy spots. This time, we're going for the real wilderness experience." As they climbed higher into the Pocono Mountains, an eerie silence descended upon the forest. The usual chirping of crickets and croaking of frogs faded away, replaced by an unsettling quiet that seemed to press in on the vehicle from all sides. Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Is it just me, or did it get really quiet all of a sudden? Jason nodded, feeling a slight chill run down his spine despite the warm summer air. Yeah, I noticed that too. Weird. As they rounded a bend, Jason caught a glimpse of something large moving through the trees. His hands tightened on the steering wheel, and he leaned forward, straining to see through the fog and darkness. Did you see that? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah looked up from her phone, alarmed. See what? I don't know, something big, probably just a deer, Jason said, trying to convince himself as much as Sarah. But the shape he'd seen had seemed much larger than any deer he'd ever encountered. They drove on in tense silence for a few more minutes before Jason spotted the small dirt road that led to their campsite. He turned off the main road, the Jeep bouncing and jostling as it navigated the uneven terrain. Almost there, he announced, relief evident in his voice. As they pulled into the small clearing that would serve as their campsite for the next few days, the hairs on the back of Jason's neck stood up. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Well, this is cozy, Sarah said, her tone uncertain as she surveyed the area. The clearing was surrounded by dense forest on all sides, the trees seeming to loom over them in the darkness. Jason forced a smile. It'll look better in the daylight. Come on, let's get set up. They worked together to unload the Jeep, setting up their tent and arranging their camping gear. As Jason hammered the last tent stake into the ground, he found himself constantly glancing over his shoulder at the dark woods surrounding them. You okay? Sarah asked, noticing his unease. You seem jumpy. Jason shrugged, trying to play it off. Just not used to it being so quiet, I guess. No city noise out here. Sarah nodded, but she didn't look entirely convinced. Yeah, it's pretty intense, but hey, that's what we came for, right? The full nature experience. As night fell, strange noises began to emanate from the forest around them. Twigs snapped, leaves rustled, and occasionally, a low rumbling sound that could have been the wind, or something else entirely, reached their ears. They sat around the campfire roasting marshmallows and trying to maintain a sense of normalcy. Jason regaled Sarah with ghost stories he'd heard as a kid, but his heart wasn't in it. The real forest around them felt far more ominous than any campfire tale. Suddenly, a blood-curdling howl echoed through the mountains, sending shivers down both their spines. It was unlike anything either of them had ever heard before. Not quite wolf, not quite bear, but something wild and primeval. Sarah nearly dropped her marshmallow stick. What the hell was that? She gasped, her eyes wide with fear. Jason stood up, peering into the darkness beyond the campfire's glow. I don't know, he admitted, his voice tight. Maybe a coyote? That was no coyote, Jason, Sarah said, standing up as well and moving closer to him. That sounded bigger. Another howl rang out, closer this time. Jason instinctively reached for Sarah's hand, squeezing it tightly. Maybe we should get in the tent, he suggested, trying to keep his voice steady. Sarah nodded vigorously. Yeah, good idea. Very good idea. They quickly doused the fire and retreated to the relative safety of their tent. As they zipped themselves in, the sounds of the forest seemed to intensify. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig, sounded like it was right outside their thin nylon walls. Jason, Sarah whispered, her voice trembling slightly. What if it's a bear? Should we have put the food in the car? Jason shook his head, trying to project more confidence than he felt. It's fine. We hung the food bag from a tree, remember? That's what you're supposed to do. They lay in silence for a while, both straining to hear any sounds of approach. The forest had gone quiet again, but somehow that was even more unnerving. Hey, Jason said softly, turning to face Sarah in the darkness. Remember when we went camping in the Catskills last summer and we thought we heard a ghost? Sarah chuckled softly, some of the tension leaving her body. Yeah, and it turned out to be that old guy snoring in the next campsite over. Exactly, Jason said, smiling even though she couldn't see it. I'm sure there's a perfectly logical explanation for all this too. We're just not used to real wilderness, that's all. As if in response to his words, a low, rumbling growl sounded just outside their tent. It was deep and guttural, unlike anything either of them had ever heard before. Sarah stifled a scream, clapping her hand over her mouth. Jason's heart raced as he strained his ears, listening for any sign of movement outside. For a moment he could have sworn he heard heavy breathing, as if some large creature was standing right next to their tent. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. The normal nighttime noises of the forest gradually returned. The hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Neither Jason nor Sarah slept much that night. They lay awake, hands clasped tightly together, jumping at every sound. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the tent fabric, Jason finally felt himself starting to relax. "See?" he said, his voice hoarse from the long, tense night. "We made it. Probably just some local wildlife checking us out." Sarah nodded, but her face was pale and drawn. "Yeah, probably," she agreed, not sounding entirely convinced. As they unzipped the tent and stepped out into the crisp morning air, Jason's foot caught on something. He looked down and froze, his blood running cold. There, pressed into the soft earth around their tent, was a series of enormous footprints. They were vaguely humanoid in shape, but far larger than any human foot Jason had ever seen. And the stride length, whatever had made these prints, was massive. "Sarah," he called, his voice barely above a whisper. "You need to see this." As Sarah came around the tent and saw the footprints, her face went even paler. "Jason," she said, her voice shaking. "What are we dealing with here?" Jason shook his head, unable to tear his eyes away from the massive prints. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I have a feeling our camping trip just got a lot more interesting than we bargained for." The morning sun continued to rise over the Pocono Mountains, casting long shadows through the trees. But for Jason and Sarah, the new day brought more fear than relief. Something was out there in these woods, something big, something unknown. And as they stood there, staring at the undeniable evidence of its passage, they both knew that their ordeal was far from over. The day dragged on with an oppressive tension hanging in the air. Jason and Sarah tried to go about their camping activities as normally as possible, but the discovery of those massive footprints that morning had shaken them both to the core. As evening approached, Jason decided to gather more firewood. "I'm going to get some more logs for the fire," he announced, picking up their small hatchet. "We should keep it burning bright tonight." Sarah looked up from where she was preparing their dinner, her eyes wide with concern. "Are you sure you want to go alone? Maybe I should come with you." Jason forced a smile, trying to project confidence he didn't feel. "It's fine. I'll stay close to the camp. Besides, one of us should stay here with our stuff." Sarah nodded reluctantly. "Okay, but please be careful. And take the flashlight." Jason grabbed the flashlight and headed into the woods surrounding their campsite. The sun was setting rapidly, long shadows stretching between the trees. He tried to focus on the task at hand, gathering fallen branches and occasionally chopping at larger pieces of wood. As he worked, the forest grew darker and quieter. The usual evening chorus of birds fell silent, replaced by an eerie stillness that made the hair on the back of Jason's neck stand up. He paused, listening intently, but heard nothing except the pounding of his own heart. Deciding he had enough wood, Jason turned to head back to camp. That's when he saw them, two glowing eyes staring at him from the darkness between the trees. He froze in terror, his breath catching in his throat. The eyes were unlike anything he'd ever seen. They were huge, easily the size of softballs, and seemed to emit their own pale, greenish light. They were set too high off the ground to belong to any normal forest animal. Jason's mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. A bear standing on its hind legs? But no bear had eyes like that. As he stood paralyzed with fear, A low, rumbling growl emanated from the direction of those glowing orbs. It was the same sound they'd heard outside their tent the night before. Panic surged through Jason's body. He dropped the firewood and bolted, sprinting back towards the campsite. Branches whipped at his face as he ran, but he barely felt them. All he could focus on was the sound of heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush behind him. "Sarah!" he yelled as he burst into the clearing. "Sarah, we need to go! Now!" Sarah jumped up from the campfire, her face pale with shock. "Jason? What happened? What's wrong?" "There's something out there," Jason gasped, trying to catch his breath. "Something big. We need to leave." Before Sarah could respond, a deafening roar echoed through the forest, so close it seemed to shake the ground. Sarah screamed, instinctively moving closer to Jason. "What was that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Jason replied, his eyes scanning the tree line. "But I saw its eyes. They were glowing, Sarah, like nothing I've ever seen before." As they stood there, frozen in fear, a new smell permeated the air. It was a foul, musky odor that made them both gag. It reminded Jason of a zoo enclosure, but stronger and wilder. "Oh God," Sarah choked out, covering her nose. "What is that smell?" Jason shook his head, fighting the urge to vomit. "I don't know, but we can't stay here. We need to pack up and go." They rushed to break down their camp, hands shaking as they tried to quickly dismantle the tent and gather their belongings. The stench grew stronger, and the sounds of something large moving through the forest grew closer. As Jason was shoving the last of their gear into the jeep, Sarah suddenly gasped. "Jason?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Look." He turned to see what had caught her attention and felt his blood run cold. There, in the soft mud at the edge of their campsite, was a series of fresh footprints. They were identical to the ones they'd found that morning, massive, vaguely human-shaped, but far too large to belong to any person. "It's circling us," Jason realized aloud, his voice tight with fear. Sarah grabbed his arm, her nails digging into his skin. "We need to go, now." They scrambled into the jeep, Jason fumbling with the keys as he tried to start the engine. Just as it roared to life, a loud crash came from the woods directly in front of them. The underbrush shook violently, as if something enormous was about to emerge. "Go, go, go!" Sarah screamed. Jason slammed the jeep into reverse, tires spinning in the dirt as he backed out of the campsite. As they turned onto the narrow dirt road, his headlights swept across the tree line. For a split second, they illuminated a massive hair-covered form standing at the edge of the clearing. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long arms that nearly reached the ground. Sarah's scream filled the car as Jason floored the accelerator, the jeep bouncing wildly as they sped down the rough road. In the rearview mirror, he caught a glimpse of those glowing eyes watching them retreat. Before they were swallowed up by the darkness, they drove in terrified silence for several miles, both jumping at every shadow and sound. Finally, when they reached the main road, Jason pulled over, his hands shaking too badly to drive safely. "What?" Sarah began, her voice hoarse. "What was that thing?" Jason shook his head, still trying to process what he'd seen. "I don't know. It was huge, whatever it was, like a giant ape, but standing upright." "You don't think—" Sarah trailed off as if afraid to voice her thought. "What?" "BigFoot," she whispered, looking embarrassed even as she said it. "I know it sounds crazy, but what else could it be?" Under normal circumstances, Jason would have laughed at the suggestion. But after what he'd just seen, he couldn't dismiss it outright. "I don't know," he admitted. "But whatever it was real. And dangerous." They sat in silence for a few moments, the reality of their situation sinking in. Finally, Sarah spoke up. "What do we do now? Should we call the police?" Jason considered it. "And tell them what? That we were chased out of the woods by a giant, smelly ape man? They'd think we were drunk or high." "So we just go home?" Sarah asked, sounding uncertain. Jason nodded slowly. For now, yeah. We need to process this, figure out what really happened. They drove home in a daze, both lost in their own thoughts. As they parted ways for the night, Sarah hugged Jason tightly. Try to get some sleep, she said. We'll talk tomorrow. But sleep didn't come easily for Jason that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those glowing orbs staring at him from the darkness. He tossed and turned, his mind replaying the events of the day over and over. In the early hours of the morning, Jason finally drifted into a fitful sleep. But even in his dreams, he couldn't escape. He found himself back in those dark woods, something massive crashing through the trees behind him. He ran and ran, but his legs felt like lead. Suddenly, he was back in his tent. All was quiet for a moment, and he breathed a sigh of relief. Then, without warning, something brushed against the outside of the tent. A low, rumbling breath sounded just inches from his head. Jason woke with a start, sitting bolt upright in bed. His heart was racing, and his t-shirt was soaked with sweat. As he sat there in the pre-dawn light, trying to calm his breathing, one thought kept running through his mind. What had they stumbled upon in those mountains? And more importantly, what were they going to do about it? The days following their terrifying encounter in the Pocono Mountains passed in a haze of sleepless nights and paranoid days for Jason and Sarah. They tried to convince themselves that what they had experienced was just a shared hallucination, a trick of the light and their overactive imaginations. But deep down, they both knew the truth. Something was out there. Something that defied explanation. A week after their aborted camping trip, Sarah called Jason. I can't stop thinking about it, she said, her voice tight with anxiety. We need to go back, Jason. We need to know for sure. Jason hesitated, torn between his fear and his burning curiosity. Are you sure that's a good idea? Whatever that thing was, it was dangerous. I know, Sarah replied, but if we don't face this, we'll never be able to move on. We need answers, Jason. After a long pause, Jason agreed. They made plans to return to the campsite the following weekend, this time armed with cameras and more robust camping gear. They told themselves they were being cautious, prepared for anything. In reality, they were woefully unprepared for what awaited them in those dark woods. As they set up camp in the fading light of day, the forest seemed to close in around them. The trees loomed taller, their shadows deeper and more menacing than before. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves set their nerves on edge. Maybe this wasn't such a good idea, Sarah murmured as they finished securing their tent. Jason forced a smile, trying to project a confidence he didn't feel. It'll be fine. We're prepared this time. And hey, maybe it was all just in our heads, right? But as night fell, the oppressive silence that had unnerved them on their previous visit descended once more. No crickets chirped, no owls hooted. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting. They huddled around their campfire, jumping at every shadow that danced at the edge of the firelight. As the hours ticked by with no sign of the creature, they began to relax slightly. See? Jason said, poking at the fire with a stick. Nothing to worry about. We probably just spooked ourselves last time. Sarah nodded, but her eyes kept darting to the darkness beyond their camp. Yeah, maybe you're right. Still, I'll feel better once the sun comes up. They decided to turn in for the night, crawling into their tent with a mixture of relief and lingering apprehension. As they settled into their sleeping bags, the forest seemed to press in around them, the silence becoming almost tangible. Jason had just begun to drift off when a twig snapped loudly outside their tent. His eyes flew open, heart racing. Sarah, he whispered. Did you hear that? Sarah nodded, her face pale in the dim light of their lantern. It's probably just an animal, she said, but her trembling voice betrayed her fear. Another snap, closer this time, then another. Whatever was out there, it was big, and it was getting closer. Suddenly, a foul, musky odor filled the air, so strong it made their eyes water. It was the same stench they had encountered on their previous visit. Oh, God, Sarah whimpered, It's here. Before Jason could respond, an ear-splitting roar shattered the night. It was a sound of pure primal rage, unlike anything they had ever heard before. The tent shook with the force of it. Then, without warning, gigantic hairy hands tore through the tent fabric as if it were tissue paper. Sarah's scream pierced the night, mingling with Jason's own cry of terror. In the chaos that followed, Jason caught glimpses of their attacker, a massive, ape-like creature covered in thick, matted fur. Its eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, filled with a terrifying intelligence. "Sarah!" Jason yelled, reaching for her as the creature's enormous hands closed around her. "Sarah, hold on." But the Bigfoot, for what else could it be, was impossibly strong. With a roar that seemed to shake the very ground, it effortlessly lifted Sarah off the ground. She thrashed and screamed, her fingers clawing at the air as she was pulled away from Jason. Jason's body trembled uncontrollably as he desperately tried to fight off the monster. He lunged forward, grabbing at its thick fur, trying to pull Sarah free, but it was like trying to move a mountain. The creature swatted Jason aside with a casual backhand, sending him crashing into the remains of their tent. Stars exploded in his vision as his head struck the ground. Through the ringing in his ears, he heard Sarah's screams growing fainter as the Bigfoot carried her into the forest. Panic surged through him, giving him the strength to stagger to his feet. "Sarah!" he yelled, stumbling after them. "I'm coming, hold on!" Blood pounded in Jason's ears as he crashed through the underbrush, following the sound of Sarah's fading cries. Branches whipped at his face, roots threatened to trip him at every step, but he pushed on, driven by sheer desperation. The forest seemed to come alive around him, shadows dancing in the corners of his vision. More than once, he thought he saw other large, hairy figures moving through the trees, but when he turned to look, they vanished. Sarah's screams had faded to barely audible whimpers, punctuated by the crashing sounds of the Bigfoot's passage through the forest. Jason's lungs burned, his legs ached, but he refused to give up. "Sarah!" he called out again, his voice hoarse. "Where are you?" A faint cry answered him somewhere off to his left. Jason changed course, pushing through a dense thicket. As he emerged on the other side, he found himself at the edge of a small clearing. There, in the center, stood the Bigfoot. It was even larger than Jason had realized, towering at least 8 feet tall. In one massive arm, it held Sarah, who hung limply in its grasp. "Let her go!" Jason yelled, his voice cracking with fear and exhaustion. The creature turned, its glowing eyes fixing on Jason. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, with deliberate slowness, it set Sarah down on the ground. Hope surged through Jason. Was it going to release her? But then the Bigfoot straightened to its full height and let out a roar that seemed to shake the very trees. From the surrounding forest came answering calls. 1, 2, 3, more than Jason could count. His blood ran cold as he realized the horrifying truth. They weren't dealing with a single creature. There was a whole group of them. "Jason," Sarah's weak voice cut through his panic. "Jason, run. Please, just run." But Jason couldn't move. He stood frozen as dark shapes began to emerge from the trees surrounding the clearing. Glowing eyes stared at him from every direction, filled with an alien intelligence that chilled him to his core. The first Bigfoot, the one that had taken Sarah, took a step towards Jason. Its massive fists clenched and unclenched, and a low, rumbling growl emanated from its chest. In that moment, Jason knew he had a choice to make. He could turn and run, possibly saving himself but abandoning Sarah, or he could stand his ground and face whatever came next. With a deep breath, Jason planted his feet firmly on the ground. "I'm not leaving without Sarah," he said, surprised at the steadiness in his voice. The Bigfoot tilted its head almost as if it understood. Then, faster than Jason would have thought possible for something so large, it charged. Jason had time for one last thought. "I'm sorry, Sarah," before the creature was upon him. He closed his eyes, bracing for the impact, but it never came. Instead, A deafening roar filled the air, followed by the sound of something massive hitting the ground. Jason's eyes flew open to see the Bigfoot lying at his feet, felled by... what? A bright light suddenly illuminated the clearing, and the sound of voices and dogs barking filled the air. The other creatures melted back into the forest with incredible speed, leaving no trace of their presence. As Jason stood there, trying to process what had just happened, a group of men in uniforms burst into the clearing. They were armed with tranquilizer guns and bright flashlights. "Are you all right?" one of them asked, rushing to Jason's side. "We've been tracking these creatures for weeks. You're lucky we got here when we did." Jason barely heard him. His eyes were fixed on Sarah, who was being tended to by another member of the team. She was alive, battered and terrified, but alive. As the reality of their rescue began to sink in, Jason felt his knees give way. He sank to the ground, his body finally giving in to the shock and exhaustion. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was Sarah being carefully lifted onto a stretcher, her eyes meeting his across the clearing. In that moment, he knew their ordeal was far from over. Jason's world spun as consciousness slowly returned. The harsh glare of fluorescent lights assaulted his eyes, and the antiseptic smell of a hospital filled his nostrils. For a moment, he thought it had all been a terrible nightmare. But as the fog of unconsciousness lifted, the terrifying memories came flooding back. "Sarah," he gasped, sitting up abruptly. A wave of dizziness washed over him, and he felt gentle hands pushing him back onto the bed. "Easy there, son," a gruff voice said. "You've been through quite an ordeal." As Jason's vision cleared, he found himself looking into the weathered face of a man in his 50s, dressed in a park ranger's uniform. The man's eyes were kind, but there was a weariness in them that spoke of having seen things most people couldn't imagine. "Where's Sarah?" Jason demanded, his voice hoarse. "Is she okay?" The ranger nodded. "Your friend is safe. She's in another room, being treated for minor injuries and shock. You both had a close call out there." Jason slumped back, relief washing over him. But it was short-lived as the full implications of what had happened began to sink in. "Those things," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They were real, weren't they? It wasn't just in our heads." The ranger's face grew serious. "I'm afraid so, son. What you encountered out there, well, let's just say it's something we've been dealing with for a long time." Before Jason could ask any more questions, a doctor entered the room, clipboard in hand. After a brief examination and a battery of questions, Jason was cleared to leave. As he was gathering his things, the ranger approached him again. "Listen," he said in a low voice. "I know you probably have a lot of questions, but for your own safety and the safety of others, it's best if you don't talk about what happened out there. Official story is that you and your friend were attacked by a bear. Stick to that, understood?" Jason nodded numbly, his mind reeling. As he left the hospital room, he caught sight of Sarah being wheeled down the hallway. Their eyes met, and in that moment, he saw the same mix of relief, terror, and confusion that he felt. The next few days passed in a blur of police statements, medical checkups, and sleepless nights. Jason and Sarah stuck to the bear attack story as instructed, but when they were alone, they couldn't stop talking about what they had really seen. "We can't just let this go, Jason," Sarah said one evening, as they sat in his apartment, cups of untouched coffee growing cold between them. "Those things are out there. What if they hurt someone else?" Jason ran a hand through his hair, conflicted. "I know, but what can we do? No one would believe us if we told the truth. And that ranger, he seemed to know more than he was letting on." Sarah's eyes lit up with a determined fire. "Then we go back. We find proof." "Are you insane?" Jason exclaimed. "After what happened last time?" But even as he protested, Jason knew deep down that Sarah was right. They couldn't just ignore what they had seen, they needed answers. And so against all logic and self-preservation instincts, they found themselves back in the Pocono Mountains a week later. This time, they were better prepared, or so they thought. Cameras, stronger flashlights, and even a small tranquilizer gun they had managed to acquire through less than legal means. As night fell, they made their way through the forest, retracing their steps to where they had last seen the creatures. The woods seemed different now, more sinister. Every shadow held the potential for danger, every sound a possible threat. "Maybe this wasn't such a good idea," Sarah whispered, her flashlight beam dancing nervously across the undergrowth. Before Jason could respond, a blood-curdling roar shattered the night air. It was close. Too close. "Run!" Jason yelled, grabbing Sarah's hand and pulling her along as he broke into a sprint. Branches whipped across Jason's face as he ran blindly through the dense undergrowth. He could hear Sarah's ragged breathing behind him, punctuated by the crashing sounds of something large pursuing them through the forest. His lungs burned as he struggled to keep up with the creature's inhuman speed. How could something so large move so quickly? The sound of breaking branches and heavy footfalls seemed to come from all around them, as if they were being herded. Suddenly, Sarah's hand was torn from his grasp. He heard her scream, the sound cutting off abruptly. Jason skidded to a stop, spinning around wildly. "Sarah," he yelled into the darkness. "Sarah, where are you?" There was no response, just the oppressive silence of the forest. Panic clawed at Jason's chest as he realized he was alone, lost in the pitch-black woods with those monsters lurking somewhere in the shadows. He fumbled with his flashlight, his hands shaking so badly he could barely keep the beam steady. As he swept it across the forest floor, searching desperately for any sign of Sarah, his foot caught on an exposed root. Jason crashed to the ground, the impact knocking the wind out of him. As he lay there, gasping for air, Sarah's screams grew more distant. The sound galvanized him, forcing him back to his feet despite the pain. He couldn't lose her again. Jason staggered forward, following the fading sounds of Sarah's cries. But with each step, they seemed to grow fainter, until he could no longer be sure if he was hearing her, or just the echo of her screams in his mind. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He was hopelessly lost. The forest stretched out in every direction, a maze of shadows and menace. His flashlight, which had seemed so powerful back in the safety of the city, now felt woefully inadequate against the pressing darkness. "Sarah," he called out again, his voice cracking with desperation. "Sarah, please answer me." Only the mocking echo of his own voice answered him. Jason spun in a slow circle, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. Trees, rocks, more trees, nothing but the endless forest. Then, just as he was about to give up hope, his flashlight beam caught a glimpse of something. Matted fur, disappearing behind a large boulder. Jason's heart leapt into his throat. One of the creatures. Without thinking, he charged after it. "Hey!" he yelled. "Stop! Where's Sarah?" As he rounded the boulder, his flashlight illuminated a small clearing. And there, in the center, stood not one, but 3 of the massive ape-like creatures. They turned as one to face him, their eyes glowing with that eerie, intelligent light. Jason froze, his body trembling uncontrollably. This was it. He was going to die here, alone in these godforsaken woods. But then he saw her, Sarah, held firmly but seemingly unharmed in the grasp of the largest creature. Their eyes met across the clearing, and Jason saw a mixture of terror and relief in her gaze. "Jason," she called out, her voice weak but steady. "Jason, run. Please, just go." But Jason couldn't move. He couldn't leave her, not again. His hand tightened on the tranquilizer gun in his pocket. It was a long shot, but it was all he had. As he began to slowly draw the weapon, the creatures tensed. The largest one, the one holding Sarah, took a step forward. It opened its mouth, and to Jason's utter shock, a sound emerged that was almost words. "No. Harm," it growled, the sounds guttural and barely intelligible. "Must protect." Jason's mind reeled. They could speak? What were they trying to protect? Before he could process this new development, a bright light suddenly flooded the clearing. The creatures roared in unison. the sound so powerful it seemed to shake the very ground. "There they are!" a voice shouted. "Take them down!" Chaos erupted in the small clearing. Men in tactical gear swarmed in from all sides, brandishing weapons that fired crackling bolts of electricity. The creatures fought back with terrifying strength, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. In the confusion, Jason saw Sarah break free from the creature's grasp. He lunged forward, grabbing her hand and pulling her towards the edge of the clearing. "Come on!" he yelled over the din of the battle. "We have to get out of here!" As they ran, Jason glanced back over his shoulder. The largest creature, the one that had spoken, caught his eye. There was something in its gaze, not anger or hatred, but a profound sadness. Then a net crackled with electricity around it and it fell from view. Jason and Sarah ran until their legs gave out, collapsing in a small gully some distance from the clearing. As they lay there, gasping for breath, the sounds of the conflict faded into the distance. What just happened?" Sarah panted, her eyes wide with shock and confusion. Jason shook his head, still trying to process everything he had seen and heard. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I think we just stumbled into something much bigger than we realized." As the adrenaline began to wear off, the full weight of their situation settled over them. They were lost in a dark forest, with unknown creatures and armed men hunting them. And somewhere in the chaos, one of those creatures had spoken to them. "We need to get out of here," Jason said, struggling to his feet. "We need to tell someone what's really going on." Sarah nodded, her face set with determination despite her obvious exhaustion. "But who would believe us?" As they began to make their way through the dark forest, guided only by the dim light of their remaining flashlight, Jason realized that their ordeal was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. Whatever secrets these woods held, whatever forces were at work here, they were now irrevocably entangled in it all. And somewhere in the back of his mind, those guttural words echoed, "Must protect." What were these creatures protecting? And from whom? As they stumbled through the darkness, Jason knew that finding those answers might be the only way to truly escape. Jason and Sarah stumbled through the dark forest, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The sounds of pursuit had faded, but the memory of the chaos they'd just escaped lingered like a nightmare. Jason's mind raced, trying to make sense of what they'd witnessed. The creatures, the armed men, and most disturbingly, the words the largest BigFoot had growled. "No harm. Must protect. We need to find a way out of here," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling with exhaustion and fear. "Those men, they weren't park rangers or police. Who were they?" Jason shook his head, his flashlight beam cutting weakly through the oppressive darkness. "I don't know, but they seemed prepared for those creatures like they'd been hunting them." As they pushed through a thick patch of underbrush, Sarah suddenly stopped, grabbing Jason's arm. "Wait," she hissed. "Do you smell that?" Jason paused, inhaling deeply. A foul odor hung in the air, a mixture of decay and a musky animal scent that made his stomach churn. It was familiar, the same stench they'd encountered during their first terrifying encounter with the BigFoot. "It's close," he murmured, his grip tightening on the flashlight. "We should go another way." But Sarah's eyes had a determined glint. "No, Jason. This might be our chance to find out what's really going on. We need answers." Jason wanted to argue, to insist they find their way back to civilization and forget this whole nightmare. But he knew Sarah was right. They were in too deep now to simply walk away. With great reluctance, he nodded. "Okay, but we need to be careful. At the first sign of danger, we run." "Agreed?" Sarah nodded, and they pressed on, following the intensifying odor. The forest seemed to grow denser, the trees pressing in closer, their gnarled branches reaching out like grasping fingers. The beam of Jason's flashlight grew dimmer, the batteries weakening at the worst possible moment. Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet changed. Instead of soft forest loam, they were walking on bare rock. Jason's flashlight beam revealed a small clearing ahead, and at its far end, a dark opening in the rock face. "A cave," Sarah breathed, her eyes wide. As they approached, The stench grew overwhelming. Jason gagged, covering his nose with his shirt. The cave entrance loomed before them, a gaping maw of absolute darkness that seemed to swallow what little light remained from the flashlight. "I don't like this," Jason muttered, every instinct screaming at him to turn back. Sarah moved forward, her face a mask of determination tinged with fear. "We've come this far. We can't turn back now." Steeling himself, Jason followed her into the cave. The smell of decay and animal musk was so strong here, it made his eyes water. As they ventured deeper, his faltering flashlight beam revealed a horrifying scene. Scattered across the cave floor were shreds of clothing, torn and stained with what looked disturbingly like blood. Broken camping gear lay strewn about, a crushed lantern here, a mangled tent pole there. It was as if they'd stumbled into a graveyard of lost campers and hikers. "Oh, God," Sarah choked out, her face pale in the dim light. "What happened here?" Before Jason could respond, a low, rumbling growl emanated from the depths of the cave. The sound froze them both in place, their hearts pounding so loudly it seemed to echo off the stone walls. "We need to go," Jason whispered urgently, grabbing Sarah's arm. "Now!" But as they turned to flee, Jason's flashlight beam caught something that made his blood run cold. There, lying in the shadows near the cave wall, was an unconscious human form. With a jolt of recognition, he realized it was Sarah, or rather, it was Sarah as she had been when the Bigfoot had first taken her. That's me," Sarah gasped, her voice filled with confusion and terror. Jason's mind reeled. How was this possible? The Sarah standing next to him was real, warm and alive. Yet there she was, lying unconscious in the cave. Before he could process this impossibility, the ground beneath their feet began to shake. From the darkness at the back of the cave emerged a massive figure. It was the Bigfoot, larger and more terrifying than Jason remembered. It towered over them, its glowing eyes fixed on the intruders who had dared to enter its lair. "Run!" Jason yelled, pushing Sarah towards the cave entrance. But the creature was impossibly fast. With one giant stride, it blocked their escape route, its massive form filling the cave opening. Trapped, Jason and Sarah pressed themselves against the cave wall. The Bigfoot loomed over them, its hot, fetid breath washing over them in waves. Jason raised the flashlight, more as a pitiful shield than anything else, its weak beam illuminating the creature's face. What he saw made him gasp. The Bigfoot's eyes, those terrifying glowing orbs, were filled not with rage or hunger, but with an unmistakable intelligence, and more shockingly with what seemed like recognition. The creature's gaze moved from Jason to Sarah, then to the unconscious form on the cave floor. A low rumble emanated from its chest, not a growl of aggression, but almost like speech. "Protect," it growled, the word barely intelligible but unmistakable. "Must protect." Sarah, her voice shaking, spoke up. "Protect? Protect what? Who are you protecting?" The Bigfoot's eyes narrowed, studying them intently. Then, to Jason's utter astonishment, it took a step back. With agonizing slowness, it raised one massive, hair-covered arm and pointed deeper into the cave. Jason and Sarah exchanged bewildered glances. Was the creature inviting them in? "I think it wants us to follow it," Sarah whispered, her voice a mixture of fear and fascination. Jason shook his head vehemently. "Are you crazy? We should be running, not following this thing deeper into its lair." But Sarah had already taken a tentative step forward. The Bigfoot watched her, its posture tense but non-threatening. "Jason," she said softly, I think it's trying to show us something. Something important." Every fiber of Jason's being screamed at him to grab Sarah and make a break for it. But curiosity, that dangerous human trait, began to overcome his fear. What could be so important that this creature, this monster that had terrorized them, was now willing to reveal? With great reluctance, Jason nodded. "Okay," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But at the first sign of trouble, we run." No arguments. Sarah nodded, and together, they followed the Bigfoot deeper into the cave. As they walked, Jason couldn't help but glance at the unconscious form of Sarah they were leaving behind. It was like a scene from a surreal nightmare. The cave twisted and turned, opening into larger chambers before narrowing into tight passages. The stench grew stronger, and strange guttural sounds echoed from the darkness ahead. Jason's flashlight, now barely more than a feeble glow, revealed glimpses of massive, furry forms moving in the shadows. They weren't alone. Finally, they emerged into an enormous cavern. Jason's jaw dropped in awe and horror at what he saw. The walls were covered in crude but unmistakable paintings, stick figures of humans, trees, and large ape-like creatures. But it was what lay in the center of the cavern that truly shocked him. There, arranged in a rough circle, were what looked like hibernation pods straight out of a science fiction movie. Most were dark and lifeless, but a few glowed with an eerie blue light, and inside those illuminated pods, Jason could make out the forms of more Bigfoot creatures seemingly asleep or in some form of stasis. What is this place? Sarah breathed, her eyes wide with wonder and fear. The Bigfoot that had led them here moved to stand beside one of the glowing pods. It placed a massive hand on the transparent surface, a gesture that seemed almost tender. "Protect," it growled again, looking back at Jason and Sarah. "Last of us. Must protect." Understanding began to dawn on Jason. "They're not just animals," he said slowly. They're an endangered species, an intelligent species." Sarah nodded, her scientific mind racing to process what they were seeing. But how? How could something like this exist without the world knowing? Before Jason could respond, a new sound filled the cavern, the unmistakable echo of boots on stone. The armed men from before had found the cave. The Bigfoot's demeanor changed instantly. It let out a roar that shook dust from the cavern ceiling, a call to arms that was answered by more roars from the surrounding darkness. "We have to get out of here," Jason said urgently, grabbing Sarah's hand. "Whatever's going on, we're in the middle of a war we don't understand." But as they turned to flee, they found their path blocked by more Bigfoot creatures, emerging from hidden alcoves and side passages. They were surrounded. The lead Bigfoot, the one that had brought them here, stepped forward, its eyes filled with that unsettling intelligence, fixed on Jason and Sarah. It spoke again, its words clearer this time, as if it was learning with each attempt. "You see truth," it growled. "You help protect?" Jason and Sarah looked at each other, a silent communication passing between them. They were being offered a choice: to run, to try and return to their normal lives and forget what they'd seen, or to stay, to become part of something beyond their wildest imaginations, to help protect a secret that could change the world. The sound of approaching soldiers grew louder. Time was running out. "What do we do?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jason looked around the cavern, at the ancient paintings that told a story older than human civilization, at the hibernation pods that held the key to an incredible mystery. He thought of the unconscious Sarah back in the outer cave, a puzzle he still couldn't comprehend. He took a deep breath, knowing that whatever choice they made, their lives would never be the same. "We stay," he said finally, his voice firm despite his racing heart. "We help." Sarah nodded, a mix of fear and excitement in her eyes. "We help," she echoed. As the sounds of conflict erupted at the cave entrance, Jason and Sarah stood their ground, surrounded by creatures that had gone from nightmares to potential allies in the span of a night. Whatever came next, they knew they were now part of something far bigger than themselves. The true nature of the Bigfoot, the reason for their secrecy, the identity of their pursuers. All these questions and more swirled in Jason's mind. The cavern erupted into chaos as the armed men burst through the entrance. Gunfire echoed off the stone walls, the muzzle flashes illuminating the massive forms of the Bigfoot creatures as they charged to defend their sanctuary. Jason and Sarah found themselves caught in the middle of a war between two worlds, the modern world of man and the hidden world of these ancient, intelligent beings. "We need to find cover," Jason yelled over the din, pulling Sarah behind a large stalagmite. His heart raced as he tried to process the surreal scene unfolding before them. The Bigfoot that had led them into the cavern, the one they had started to think of as their ally, let out an ear-splitting roar that shook dust from the ceiling. It charged towards the invading forces with terrifying speed, its massive form moving with a fluidity that belied its size. Sarah gripped Jason's arm, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and awe. "We can't just hide here," she shouted. "We have to do something." Jason nodded, his mind racing. They had promised to help protect these creatures, but what could two unarmed humans do against a squad of well-equipped soldiers? As he scanned the cavern, searching for any way they could assist, his eyes fell on the hibernation pods. "The pods," he said, an idea forming. "If those men are here to capture or kill these creatures, we need to protect the sleeping ones. Come on." They darted from behind their cover, keeping low as they made their way towards the circle of hibernation pods. The battle raged around them, Bigfoot creatures grappling with soldiers, the air filled with roars of pain and anger from both sides. As they reached the pods, Jason's hands flew over the unfamiliar technology, searching for any kind of control panel or emergency protocol. "There has to be a way to secure these," he muttered, frustration mounting. Suddenly, a massive shadow loomed over them. Jason looked up to see one of the Bigfoot creatures standing there, its eyes locked on them. For a moment he feared they had made a terrible mistake, that the creature saw them as a threat to its sleeping kin. But then the Bigfoot reached out one enormous hand and pressed it against a seemingly blank part of the nearest pod. A soft blue light pulsed under its palm and a low hum filled the air. One by one, the occupied pods began to sink into the ground, disappearing into hidden compartments beneath the cavern floor. "They're Sarah's words were cut short as a hail of gunfire peppered the ground near their feet. The Bigfoot that had helped them roared in pain and anger as several bullets found their mark in its broad back. "No!" Jason yelled, a surge of protective fury washing over him. Without thinking, he grabbed a fallen soldier's weapon and fired back at the attackers, forcing them to take cover. The wounded Bigfoot turned to Jason, surprise and what might have been gratitude in its intelligent eyes. But there was no time for reflection. More soldiers were pouring into the cavern, and the Bigfoot creatures, despite their incredible strength and ferocity, were being overwhelmed by sheer numbers and firepower. "We need to get out of here," Sarah shouted, tugging at Jason's arm. "We can't win this fight." Jason nodded grimly. They had done what they could to protect the sleeping Bigfoot, but now they needed to save themselves, and perhaps find a way to help these creatures from the outside. As they turned to flee, a terrifying sight stopped them in their tracks. The largest Bigfoot they had seen yet, a true giant among giants, was charging straight towards them. Its eyes blazed with fury, either not recognizing them as allies or too caught up in battle rage to care. Jason's ears rang from the creature's ear-splitting roar as it charged towards him. Time seemed to slow as the massive form bore down on them, its enormous fists raised to strike. "Look out!" Sarah screamed, pushing Jason to the side just as the Bigfoot's fists smashed into the cave wall where they had been standing. Chunks of rock exploded outward, showering them with debris. Jason scrambled to his feet, pulling Sarah up with him. They ran, weaving between battling soldiers and Bigfoot, desperately searching for a way out of the chaos. But the enraged creature was hot on their heels, its thunderous footsteps shaking the ground beneath them. They found themselves backed into a corner, the massive Bigfoot looming over them. Its hot, rancid breath washed over Jason as it pinned him against the rocks, one enormous hand easily encircling his throat. "We're trying to help," Jason choked out, struggling to breathe as the creature's grip tightened. Sarah grabbed a nearby rock and smashed it against the Bigfoot's arm, screaming, "Let him go! We're on your side!" The creature's head snapped towards Sarah, its eyes narrowing. For a moment, Jason thought it would simply crush him and then move on to Sarah. But then, slowly, recognition seemed to dawn in its eyes. The grip on Jason's throat loosened, just slightly. Taking advantage of the creature's momentary hesitation, Jason brought his knee up hard, striking the Bigfoot in its midsection. It wasn't nearly enough to hurt the massive being, but the unexpected move caused it to stumble back a step, releasing Jason. Gasping for air, Jason grabbed Sarah's hand and ran. They sprinted through the cavern, dodging bullets and flying debris, making for the tunnel that led back to the cave entrance. But their path was blocked by a group of soldiers, their weapons trained on the fleeing pair. "Stop right there," one of the soldiers barked. "On your knees, hands behind your heads." Jason and Sarah exchanged a desperate look. They were trapped, with armed men in front of them and an enraged Bigfoot behind them. Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. A deafening roar filled the air, but this time it wasn't coming from any of the Bigfoot. The cave walls themselves seemed to be shaking, rocks and dust raining down from the ceiling. "Earthquake!" someone shouted, and panic ensued. In the chaos that followed, Jason saw their chance. He grabbed Sarah's hand once more and pulled her towards a small side passage he had noticed earlier. As they ran, he felt a searing pain across his back. He screamed in agony as the Bigfoot's claws raked across his chest, tearing through his shirt and into flesh. The pain was excruciating, but adrenaline surged through Jason's body, giving him the strength to keep moving. They stumbled into the narrow passage, the sounds of battle and the earthquake fading behind them. They ran through the twisting tunnel, guided only by the weak beam of Jason's nearly dead flashlight. The passage sloped upward, and soon they could see a faint glimmer of natural light ahead. With a final burst of energy, they emerged from the cave, stumbling out into the pre-dawn forest. The ground was still shaking, trees swaying dangerously around them. "We have to keep moving," Sarah panted, supporting Jason as blood seeped from his wounds. "Those soldiers might come after us." They stumbled through the woods, every step agony for Jason. After what seemed like hours but was probably only minutes, they came across an old, overgrown logging road. "Look," Sarah pointed weakly. "Tire tracks. Someone's been using this road recently." As if on cue, the distant sound of an engine reached their ears. A battered pickup truck came into view, an old man at the wheel. He stopped when he saw them, his eyes widening at their battered appearance. "Good Lord," he exclaimed, jumping out of the truck. "What happened to you two?" "Please," Sarah begged. "We need help. My friend is hurt." The old man didn't hesitate. "Get in," he said, helping them into the truck bed. "I'll get you to the hospital in town." As they drove away from the forest, Jason fought to stay conscious. He turned to Sarah, his voice weak. "We can't tell them the truth," he managed to say. Sarah nodded, understanding. Who would believe their story? "Bear attack," she said. "We'll say it was a bear." Jason nodded, relief washing over him. They had survived, but at what cost? The image of the Bigfoot creatures fighting for their lives, the mystery of the hibernation pods, the armed men who seemed to know about these beings, all of it swirled in his mind. As the truck bounced along the rough road, carrying them back to the world they knew, Jason realized that their ordeal was far from over. They had stumbled upon a secret war, a hidden world existing alongside their own, and now, for better or worse, they were part of it. The forest fell away behind them, but Jason knew they would be back. The Bigfoot creatures needed their help, and there were too many unanswered questions to simply walk away. As consciousness began to slip away, Jason made a silent promise, to himself, to Sarah, and to the intelligent beings they had encountered, that he would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The truck drove on, carrying them towards an uncertain future, leaving behind a forest that now seemed more mysterious and dangerous than ever before. The confrontation in the cave was over, but Jason knew it was only the beginning of a much larger battle, one that could change the world as they knew it. My legs burned as Sarah and I stumbled through the dense forest, the sound of crashing vegetation growing ever closer behind us. The night was pitch black, with only slivers of moonlight filtering through the thick canopy above. Our ragged breaths and the pounding of our hearts seemed deafening in the oppressive darkness. "We have to keep moving," I gasped, tightening my grip on Sarah's hand. She was barely conscious, her feet dragging as I half-carried her through the underbrush. I can't," Sarah whimpered, her voice weak and trembling. "Just leave me." "No," I shouted, pulling her along more forcefully. "I'm not leaving you behind. We're getting out of this together." The forest around us came alive with the sounds of our pursuit. Branches snapped like gunshots, and the ground shook with each thunderous footfall of the beast chasing us. Its guttural roars echoed through the trees, sending shivers down my spine and pushing us to run faster despite our exhaustion. We burst through a thick cluster of bushes, thorns tearing at our already battered skin. I skidded to a halt, my heart leaping into my throat as I realized we had reached the edge of a steep ravine. The sound of rushing water drifted up from far below, barely audible over the creature's approaching howls. "Oh God," Sarah moaned, swaying on her feet. "We're trapped." I frantically scanned our surroundings, desperate for any sign of escape. The ravine stretched out to either side, disappearing into the darkness. Behind us, the crashes and roars grew louder with each passing second. "There," I pointed to our left, where the ravine wall seemed less sheer. "We can try to climb down there. It's our only chance." Sarah nodded weakly, and we began to make our way along the treacherous edge. Loose rocks skittered beneath our feet, threatening to send us plummeting into the abyss below. The sky above began to lighten ever so slightly, the first hints of dawn creeping over the horizon. As we reached the spot I had seen, a bone-chilling roar erupted from just behind us. I turned to see the massive silhouette of the Bigfoot emerging from the tree line, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly hunger. "Go," I screamed, shoving Sarah towards the ravine wall. "Start climbing down, I'll be right behind you." Sarah hesitated for a moment, her eyes wide with fear. "But now," I yelled, giving her another push. She nodded and began to carefully lower herself over the edge. I turned to face the approaching monster, my body trembling but my resolve firm. I had to buy Sarah enough time to get a head start down the cliff. Picking up a large branch from the ground, I brandished it like a club. "Come on, you bastard," I shouted, my voice cracking with fear and exhaustion. "You want us? Come and get me." The Bigfoot's roar shook the very air around me as it charged forward. I stood my ground, waiting until the last possible second before diving to the side. The creature's massive arm swung through the space where I had been standing, the wind from its passage ruffling my hair. I scrambled to my feet and swung the branch with all my might, connecting with the beast's side. The impact sent shockwaves up my arms, and the branch splintered. The Bigfoot barely seemed to notice the blow, turning to face me with a low growl. "Sarah, keep going," I yelled over my shoulder, hoping she was making progress down the ravine wall. "I'll hold it off." The creature lunged forward again, its huge hands grasping for me. I ducked and rolled, feeling the rush of air as its fingers barely missed my head. As I came up from the roll, my foot slipped on the loose gravel near the ravine's edge. For a heart-stopping moment, I teetered on the brink of the cliff. The Bigfoot seized this opportunity, charging straight at me with earth-shaking steps. In that split second, I made a decision. Just as the monster reached me, I let myself fall backward over the edge of the ravine. The world spun around me as I tumbled down the steep incline. Rocks and branches tore at my clothes and skin, each impact sending jolts of pain through my body. Above me, I heard the frustrated roar of the Bigfoot, unable to follow down the sheer cliff face. "Sarah!" I called out as I tumbled, trying to spot her in the pre-dawn gloom. "Sarah, where are you?" "Here." Her voice came from somewhere below and to my left. "I'm here." I tried to angle my descent in her direction, but I had little control over my fall. The ground rushed up to meet me, and I braced for impact. With a bone-jarring thud, I landed on a small ledge jutting out from the ravine wall. Pain exploded through my body, and for a moment all I could do was lie there, gasping for breath. The sound of Sarah's voice snapped me back to reality. "Are you okay?" she called, her voice closer now. Can you move? Groaning, I pushed myself up to a sitting position. Every part of me ached, but nothing seemed to be broken. Yeah, I managed to croak. I'm alive. Where are you? Just below you, Sarah replied. There's a path here, I think. An animal trail or something. I peered over the edge of my ledge and saw Sarah clinging to the ravine wall about 10 feet below. As my eyes adjusted to the growing light, I could make out a narrow trail winding its way down the cliff face. Okay, I said, taking a deep breath to steady myself. I'm coming down. Be careful, and keep moving. That thing might find another way down. As if in response to my words, an enraged howl echoed from above us. The BigFoot was still up there, searching for a way to reach its prey. I carefully lowered myself from the ledge, my muscles screaming in protest. The trail was barely wide enough for one person, forcing us to edge along sideways, our backs pressed against the cliff wall. Loose rocks skittered beneath our feet, disappearing into the darkness below. Don't look down, I advised, trying to keep my voice steady. Just focus on the path ahead. Sarah nodded, her face pale and streaked with dirt and tears. I can't believe this is happening, she whispered. What was that thing? I don't know, I admitted, inching along behind her. But we can figure it out later. Right now, we just need to get out of here. We continued our slow descent, the sound of the river growing louder with each careful step. The sky above us lightened further, revealing the true depth of the ravine. My stomach churned at the sight of the sheer drop beside us. Suddenly, Sarah's foot slipped on a patch of loose gravel. She cried out, her body pitching forward over the edge of the narrow path. My heart nearly stopped as I lunged forward, grabbing her arm just as she began to fall. I've got you, I shouted, straining to hold on to her. Sarah dangled over the abyss, her feet scrabbling for purchase on the cliff face. Swing your legs, try to find the path. Sarah's eyes were wide with terror as she looked up at me. Don't let go, she pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper. Never, I grunted, using all my strength to start pulling her up. Come on, help me out here, you can do it. With a monumental effort, we managed to get Sarah back onto the path. We clung to each other, shaking with adrenaline and fear. Thank you, Sarah breathed, burying her face in my chest. I thought I was going to die. I held her tightly, my own heart racing. We're going to make it, I assured her, hoping I sounded more confident than I felt. We're almost there. Just a little further. As we caught our breath, preparing to continue our descent, a chilling sound reached our ears. From somewhere above and to our right came the unmistakable noise of breaking branches and rolling rocks. No, I whispered, looking up in horror. It can't be. Through the trees lining the top of the ravine, I caught glimpses of a large, dark shape moving parallel to us. The BigFoot had found another way down, a less steep section of the cliff that it could navigate with its incredible strength and agility. We have to move, I urged, gently pushing Sarah to start moving again. Now it's found a way down. Sarah's eyes widened in fear, but she nodded resolutely and began to edge along the path once more. We moved as quickly as we dared, the narrow trail forcing us to maintain a maddeningly slow pace. The sounds of the creature's descent grew louder, punctuated by its occasional roars of frustration and determination. It was covering ground much faster than we could on our precarious perch. It's going to reach the bottom before us, Sarah said, her voice tight with fear. I knew she was right. At our current pace, we would be trapped between the BigFoot and the raging river below. We needed a new plan. Wait, I said, grabbing Sarah's arm to stop her. I peered down the ravine, squinting in the growing light. Do you see that? About 50 feet down? Sarah followed my gaze. Is that a cave? Sure enough, a dark opening was visible in the cliff face below us. It wasn't much, but it was our best chance at finding shelter or another way out. We need to get down there, I said. It's our only shot. Sarah looked at me uncertainly. How? The path doesn't go that way. I took a deep breath, knowing she wouldn't like what I was about to suggest. We'll have to climb down. There are enough handholds, I think. If we're careful, we can make it. Are you insane? Sarah hissed, her eyes wide. We nearly died trying to use this path. How are we supposed to free climb down there? Another roar, closer this time, made us both flinch. We don't have a choice, I said grimly. It's either take our chances climbing down, or face that monster. What's it going to be? Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. When she opened them again, there was a steely determination in her gaze. Okay, she said. Let's do it. I nodded, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze. I'll go first. Watch where I put my hands and feet and follow my lead. We can do this. With my heart pounding in my chest, I carefully lowered myself over the edge of the path. My fingers found small crevices in the rock face, my toes seeking out tiny ledges and protrusions. Inch by inch, I began to make my way down towards the cave entrance. That's it, Sarah encouraged from above. You're doing great. I tried not to think about the drop below me or the monster somewhere above. All that mattered was finding the next handhold, the next place to put my foot. The cave entrance slowly grew larger as I descended. Okay, Sarah, I called up. Start coming down. Remember, take it slow and steady. I heard her take a shaky breath before she began to climb down after me. I kept my eyes on her, ready to shout instructions if needed. We were about halfway to the cave when a thunderous roar shook the air around us. Rocks clattered down the cliff face as the BigFoot announced its presence. It had reached the bottom of the ravine and was now making its way towards us along the riverbank. Don't look, I shouted to Sarah. Just focus on climbing. But it was too late. Sarah had turned her head to locate the source of the roar. I saw the color drain from her face as she spotted the massive creature below us. Oh God, she whimpered, her body beginning to shake. It's coming for us. Sarah, look at me, I commanded, trying to keep my own voice steady. Don't think about it, just keep climbing, we're almost there. She nodded jerkily, tears streaming down her face as she forced herself to keep moving. The cave was tantalizingly close now, maybe 20 feet below us. The Bigfoot's roars grew louder as it approached the base of the cliff where we were climbing. I risked a glance down and immediately wished I hadn't. The creature was enormous, its matted fur glistening in the early morning light. It paced back and forth at the foot of the cliff, occasionally reaching up as if trying to grab us. Keep going, I encouraged Sarah. We're going to make it. Just then, Sarah's foot slipped on a loose piece of rock. She cried out, her body swinging away from the cliff face. In her panic, one of her hands lost its grip. Sarah, I yelled, reaching out for her even though I was too far away to help. For a heart-stopping moment, Sarah dangled by one hand, her feet kicking uselessly in the air. The Bigfoot below let out a triumphant roar, sensing its prey was about to fall. Hold on, I shouted, my mind racing for a way to help her. Swing your body. Try to get your feet back on the rock. Sarah's face was a mask of terror, but she gritted her teeth and did as I said. She swung her body once, twice, 3 times. On the third swing, her feet found purchase on a small ledge. That's it, I encouraged. Now get your other hand back up there. You can do it. With a cry of effort, Sarah managed to secure her grip with both hands once more. She clung to the rock face, her whole body shaking. I can't do this, she sobbed. I can't go on. Yes, you can, I insisted. Look at me, Sarah, look at me. She raised her tear-streaked face to meet my gaze. You are stronger than you know, I told her firmly. We've come this far. We're not giving up now. That cave is right below us. Just a few more feet and we'll be safe. You can do this. I believe in you. Sarah took a deep, shuddering breath. Then, with a look of grim determination, she began to climb down once more. The Bigfoot below us roared in frustration, smashing its massive fists against the cliff face. The impact sent vibrations through the rock, making our precarious handholds even more treacherous. Almost there, I called out, seeing the cave entrance just a few feet below me now. Sarah, we're going to make it. With one final effort, I swung myself into the cave opening, my feet touching solid ground for the first time in what felt like hours. I immediately turned and reached out for Sarah. "Come on," I urged. "Just a little more." Sarah's hand grasped mine, and I pulled with all my might, helping her scramble into the cave. We collapsed onto the rocky floor, gasping for breath and shaking with exhaustion and relief. But our respite was short-lived. An ear-splitting roar reminded us that the danger was far from over. The BigFoot was still below, and from the sounds of it, it was trying to climb up to our position. "We need to go deeper into the cave," I said, struggling to my feet and pulling Sarah up with me. "There might be another way out." Sarah nodded wordlessly, too exhausted to speak. We stumbled further into the darkness of the cave, using the uneven wall as a guide. The cave narrowed as we went deeper, the ceiling lowering until we were forced to crouch. The sound of the BigFoot's roars became muffled, but we could still hear the occasional crash as it tried to reach our sanctuary. "Wait," Sarah whispered, tugging on my arm. "Do you hear that?" I stopped, straining my ears. At first, all I could hear was our ragged breathing and the faint sounds of the creature outside. But then I caught it, a faint rushing sound coming from up ahead. "Water," I breathed. "It sounds like running water." A spark of hope ignited in my chest. Where there was running water, there might be a way out. "Come on," I said, my energy renewed. "Let's check it out." We pressed on, the sound of water growing louder with each step. The cave began to widen again, and soon we found ourselves in a large cavern. A narrow underground stream cut through the center, disappearing into a low tunnel at the far end. "Look!" Sarah pointed to where the stream entered the cavern. A faint glimmer of light was visible. "That might lead outside." We hurried over to investigate, our spirits lifting for the first time since this nightmare began. The opening was narrow, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, but it definitely led to the outside world. The antiseptic smell of the hospital burned my nostrils as I lay in the stiff white bed, my chest throbbing with each heartbeat. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting an unnatural pallor over everything in the room. I could hear the steady beep of monitors and the muffled voices of nurses in the hallway, but all I could focus on were the deep, angry gashes across my torso, a stark reminder of the terror we had endured. Dr. Ramirez entered the room, clipboard in hand, his face a mask of professional detachment. "Mr. Thompson," he began, his voice steady and measured, "I understand you've been through quite an ordeal. Can you walk me through what happened again?" I sighed, frustration bubbling up inside me. This would be the third time I'd recounted our story since arriving at the hospital. Each retelling seemed to chip away at the reality of what we'd experienced, making it sound more and more far-fetched. "Doctor," I started, my voice hoarse from exhaustion. "I know how it sounds, but I'm telling you, what attacked us in those woods wasn't human. It wasn't any animal I've ever seen before." Dr. Ramirez's eyebrow raised slightly, the only crack in his professional demeanor. "Mr. Thompson, I assure you that we're taking your injuries very seriously. But you have to understand, claims of supernatural creatures, well, they're difficult for us to process." I clenched my fists, wincing as the movement pulled at my stitches. "I'm not claiming anything supernatural, Doctor. I'm telling you what I saw with my own eyes, what nearly killed me and my friends." The doctor sighed, jotting something down on his clipboard. "Let's go through it one more time, shall we? Start from the beginning." I closed my eyes, the memories flooding back with vivid clarity. We were camping in Blackwood Forest, just a weekend trip. Everything was normal until the second night. That's when we heard the howling. As I spoke, I could almost smell the pine needles, feel the chill of the night air on my skin. It wasn't like any wolf or coyote we'd ever heard. It was different, louder, more guttural, and it seemed to be coming from all around us. Dr. Ramirez nodded, his pen scratching across the paper. "And then what happened?" We tried to stay calm, but the howling kept getting closer. That's when we saw the eyes in the darkness. Glowing, unnatural eyes. And then, it attacked. I paused, my throat tightening as I recalled the moment of sheer terror. It moved so fast, Doctor. Faster than anything I've ever seen. It was massive, easily 7 feet tall when it stood on its hind legs, covered in thick matted fur. But its face? God, its face was the worst part. It was like a twisted combination of wolf and human, with a muzzle full of razor-sharp teeth. Dr. Ramirez's pen had stopped moving. He was staring at me intently, his expression unreadable. Mr. Thompson, I understand you've been through a traumatic experience. Sometimes, in moments of extreme stress, our minds can play tricks on us. Don't! I cut him off, anger flaring in my chest. Don't you dare try to tell me this was all in my head. Look at these wounds, Doctor. Do these look like something I imagined? The doctor glanced at my bandaged chest, his professional mask slipping for just a moment to reveal a flash of uncertainty. The wounds are very real, Mr. Thompson. But as for their cause, well, we'll need to run more tests. Before I could argue further, a commotion in the hallway caught our attention. Raised voices echoed through the corridor, growing louder by the second. I don't care about your protocols. That's my friend in there, and I'm going to see him. I recognized Sarah's voice immediately, a mix of relief and dread washing over me. The door burst open, and there she stood, her normally perfectly styled hair a mess, dark circles under her eyes. Behind her, a flustered nurse was trying to intervene. I'm sorry, doctor, the nurse stammered. I tried to explain that visiting hours were over, but she wouldn't listen. Dr. Ramirez waved off the nurse's concerns. It's all right. Perhaps having a corroborating witness will help clarify things. He turned to Sarah, his tone gentle but firm. Miss, I understand you were with Mr. Thompson during the incident? Sarah's eyes darted between the doctor and me, her expression a mix of worry and defiance. Yes, I was there. And everything Jake's told you is true. We were attacked by something. The doctor nodded, gesturing for her to continue. Can you describe what you saw in your own words? Sarah took a deep breath, her hands shaking slightly as she spoke. It was like nothing I've ever seen before. At first, we thought it might be a bear, but no bear moves like that. No bear has eyes that glow in the dark like that. As Sarah recounted her version of events, I could see the doubt creeping back into Dr. Ramirez's expression. He jotted down a few more notes before addressing us both. I appreciate you both sharing your experiences. However, I hope you understand that from a medical standpoint, we have to consider all possibilities. Trauma can affect memory and perception in strange ways. Sarah's face flushed with anger. Are you saying we're making this up? That Jake's injuries just appeared out of nowhere? Dr. Ramirez held up his hands in a placating gesture. Not at all. I'm simply saying that we need to approach this objectively. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to consult with my colleagues about Mr. Thompson's treatment plan. As the doctor left the room, Sarah slumped into the chair beside my bed, her anger deflating into exhaustion. I can't believe this, she muttered. No one's listening to us. It's like they think we're crazy. I reached out, taking her hand in mine. I know, but we know what we saw. We can't let them make us doubt ourselves. Sarah squeezed my hand, her eyes filling with tears. Jake, I'm scared. What if it comes back? What if it finds us here? The thought sent a chill down my spine, but I forced a reassuring smile. We're safe here, Sarah. Whatever that thing was, it's back in the forest. It can't reach us in the city. Even as I said the words, a part of me wondered if I truly believed them. The memory of those glowing eyes, that inhuman howl, seemed to follow me even here, in the sterile safety of the hospital. Our conversation was interrupted by another knock at the door. This time it was a pair of uniformed park rangers, their faces stern and official. Mr. Thompson, Miss Carter, we're from the Blackwood Forest Ranger Station. We'd like to ask you a few questions about the incident in the woods. I exchanged a wary glance with Sarah before nodding. Of course, come in. The Rangers introduced themselves as Ranger Collins and Ranger Martinez. They pulled up chairs, positioning themselves at the foot of my bed with notepads at the ready. Ranger Collins, a grizzled man with salt and pepper hair, spoke first. "We've received some unusual reports about what happened in campsite Area B last night. We were hoping you could provide some clarity." I took a deep breath, steeling myself for another retelling. "What exactly have you heard?" Ranger Martinez, younger and more clean-cut than his partner, answered. "Reports of loud disturbances, claims of an animal attack, but some of the details, well, they don't quite add up." "We're not lying," Sarah interjected, her voice tight with frustration. "We know what we saw." Ranger Collins held up a hand. "No one's accusing you of lying, miss. We're just trying to get to the bottom of what happened. Now, can you walk us through the events of that night?" For what felt like the 100th time, we recounted our horrifying experience. The initial peacefulness of the camping trip, the unsettling howls in the night, the terrifying attack that left me wounded and our other friends. I paused, suddenly realizing I hadn't heard anything about Mike and Lisa since arriving at the hospital. "Wait," I interrupted my own story. "Our friends, Mike and Lisa, are they okay? Have you found them?" The Rangers exchanged a look that made my blood run cold. Ranger Martinez cleared his throat before responding. "We've found no trace of your other companions. Search teams are still combing the area, but so far there's been no sign of them." The news hit me like a physical blow. I'd been so caught up in my own injuries and trying to make people believe our story that I'd somehow pushed the fate of our friends to the back of my mind. The guilt was overwhelming. Sarah's grip on my hand tightened, her voice barely above a whisper. "You have to find them, please. They could be hurt, or lost, or..." She couldn't finish the sentence, but we all knew the unspoken possibility hanging in the air. Ranger Collins nodded solemnly. "We're doing everything we can, but I have to be honest with you. The woods can be treacherous, especially at night. And if there is some kind of dangerous animal out there, it's not just an animal," I insisted, my voice rising. "I told you this thing was different. It was intelligent, almost human-like in some ways. You have to warn people, close off the forest or something." The Rangers shared another skeptical glance. Ranger Martinez spoke, his tone carefully neutral. "Mr. Thompson, we understand you've been through a traumatic experience, but we can't just shut down an entire national forest based on, well, on claims that we can't verify." "Can't verify?" Sarah stood up, her eyes flashing with anger. "Have you seen Jake's injuries? Do those look like something a normal animal could do?" Ranger Collins sighed, rubbing his forehead. "Miss, please try to understand our position. We've seen all kinds of animal attacks over the years. Bears, mountain lions. They can do a lot of damage. And in the dark, in a moment of panic, it's easy for the mind to play tricks." "Stop," I cut him off, my patience finally snapping. "Just stop. We're not hallucinating. We're not exaggerating. We know what we saw, what attacked us. And while you're sitting here doubting us, Mike and Lisa could be out there hurt or worse. Don't you care about that?" A tense silence fell over the room. Finally, Ranger Martinez spoke, his voice softer than before. "Of course we care, Mr. Thompson. Finding your friends is our top priority right now. But we also have a responsibility to approach this rationally, to consider all possibilities." "Including the possibility that we're telling the truth?" Sarah challenged. Ranger Collins stood, closing his notepad. "We'll continue our search and investigation. If you remember any other details, anything at all that might help us locate your friends, please don't hesitate to contact us." As the Rangers left, Sarah and I sat in stunned silence. The weight of everything, the attack, our missing friends, the constant doubt from everyone around us, felt crushing. "What are we going to do, Jake?" Sarah's voice was small, vulnerable in a way I'd never heard before. "No one believes us. Mike and Lisa are still out there, and that thing is still in those woods." I wished I had a reassuring answer for her, but the truth was, I felt just as lost and scared as she did. "I don't know, Sarah, but we can't give up. We have to keep pushing, keep trying to make them understand. For Mike and Lisa's sake, if nothing else. She nodded, wiping away a stray tear. You're right. We can't let them make us doubt ourselves. We know what we saw. As if on cue, a knock at the door interrupted our moment of solidarity. A young woman in a crisp blazer entered, a press badge hanging around her neck. Mr. Thompson, I'm Allison Chen from the local news. I was hoping I could ask you a few questions about your encounter in Blackwood Forest. My heart sank. I should have known the media would get wind of this eventually, but maybe, just maybe, this was our chance to get our story out there, to make people listen. All right, I agreed cautiously, but only if you promise to report exactly what we tell you. No twisting our words or sensationalizing things. Allison's smile was practiced, professional. Of course, we're only interested in the truth. As she set up her small camera and microphone, I couldn't shake the feeling that this interview was a mistake. But what choice did we have? We needed people to believe us, to understand the danger lurking in those woods. Ready when you are, Allison said, her camera light blinking on. Now, Mr. Thompson, in your own words, can you tell us what happened to you and your friends in Blackwood Forest? I took a deep breath, determined to make this count. It was supposed to be a normal camping trip, but on the second night we were attacked by something I can only describe as a monster. As I spoke, recounting the details of our horrifying encounter once again, I could see Allison's expression changing. The professional mask slipped, revealing flickers of doubt, even amusement. A monster? She repeated, her tone skeptical. Can you be more specific about what you saw? I've told you, I insisted, frustration building. It was huge, covered in fur, with glowing eyes and teeth like razors. It moved faster than any animal I've ever seen, and it was intelligent. You could see it in its eyes. This wasn't just some wild beast. Allison nodded, but her eyes told a different story. She didn't believe a word I was saying. And your friends? The ones who are still missing? The guilt and worry crashed over me again. Mike and Lisa, we got separated in the chaos. The Rangers are still searching for them. But I'm afraid that thing might have gotten to them. I see, Allison said, her tone maddeningly neutral. And do you have any theories about what this creature might be? Perhaps a previously undiscovered species? I could feel my temper rising. This isn't about theories or discoveries. This is about a very real, very dangerous threat in those woods. People need to be warned. Allison's smile never wavered, but there was a glint in her eye that I didn't like. Of course, Mr. Thompson. One last question. Is there anything you'd like to say to our viewers about your experience? I looked directly into the camera, my voice firm despite the pain in my chest. Yes. To anyone thinking about camping in Blackwood Forest, don't. Stay away. There's something out there, something dangerous. And to the authorities, please take this seriously. Find our friends. Close off the forest if you have to. But do something before more people get hurt. As Allison packed up her equipment thanking us for our time, I couldn't shake the sinking feeling that we'd just made a huge mistake. Sarah must have sensed it too, because she squeezed my hand reassuringly. We did what we had to do, she whispered. Someone has to listen eventually. But as the day wore on, and visitors, doctors, nurses, more rangers, even a hesitant psychologist, came and went, it became clear that our plea had fallen on deaf ears. The looks of doubt, the carefully worded questions about our mental state, the not-so-subtle implications that we might be exaggerating or confused. It was all becoming too much to bear. That night, as Sarah dozed in the chair beside my bed, I found myself unable to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing orbs staring back at me, heard that bone-chilling howl echoing through the trees. And worse, I saw Mike and Lisa, lost and afraid in the darkness, wondering why we hadn't found them yet. A soft knock at the door startled me from my dark thoughts. A nurse I hadn't seen before entered, her face kind but serious. Mr. Thompson? I'm sorry to disturb you. but there's someone here to see you. He says it's urgent." Confused and wary, I nodded. "All right, send them in." The man who entered was unlike anyone I'd seen at the hospital so far. He was older, probably in his 60s, with a weathered face and sharp, intelligent eyes. He wore a rumpled suit that had seen better days, and he carried himself with an air of barely contained energy. "Jake Thompson?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. "My name is Dr. Alan Forrester. I'm a cryptozoologist, and I think you and I need to have a very important conversation." I blinked, taken aback. "A crypto... what?" Dr. Forrester smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Cryptozoologist. I study and search for animals whose existence is unproven or disputed by mainstream science, and I believe you've had an encounter with one such creature." The soft glow of the computer screen illuminated Sarah's haggard face as she hunched over her desk, eyes bloodshot from hours of relentless searching. The clock on her nightstand blinked 3:47 a.m., but sleep was the furthest thing from her mind. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, tapping out yet another search query. "BigFoot attack Pennsylvania Poconos." The results populated her screen, a mix of sensationalist tabloid headlines and skeptical debunkings. Sarah's eyes darted from one link to the next, desperate for any shred of information that might validate her experience. She clicked on a promising forum thread, heart racing as she read the post. "Campers attacked by unknown creature in Pocono Mountains. Eyewitness account." Sarah leaned in closer, her breath catching in her throat as she devoured the details. The story was eerily similar to her own. A group of friends, a secluded campsite, and a terrifying encounter with a massive, ape-like creature. Her cursor hovered over the reply button, fingers itching to reach out to the poster, to connect with someone who might understand. But doubt crept in, whispering caution. What if it was a trap? What if the creature, or whoever was protecting it, was monitoring these forums, looking for survivors? Sarah's paranoia won out, and she closed the tab with a frustrated sigh. She pushed back from the desk, rubbing her tired eyes. The room swam into focus, and Sarah was struck by the chaos that had overtaken her once tidy apartment. Maps covered every available surface, red pins marking potential BigFoot sightings and attacks. Newspaper clippings and printouts were tacked to the walls, connected by a web of red string that looked like something out of a conspiracy theorist's fever dream. Sarah stood, stretching muscles stiff from hours of inactivity. She padded to the kitchen, pouring herself yet another cup of coffee. As she sipped the bitter liquid, her eyes fell on the calendar hanging on the fridge. It had been 3 months since that fateful camping trip. 3 months since her life had been irrevocably changed. The shrill ring of her cell phone cut through the pre-dawn silence, making Sarah jump and nearly spill her coffee. She fumbled for the device, her heart rate accelerating when she saw the caller ID. Mike, one of the few friends who still bothered to check in on her. "Hello?" Sarah answered, trying to keep the exhaustion out of her voice. "Sarah? Jesus, are you still up?" Mike's concern was palpable, even through the phone. "I couldn't sleep," Sarah lied, not wanting to admit she hadn't even tried. Mike sighed heavily. "Look, I'm worried about you. We all are. This obsession, it's not healthy." Sarah bristled at his words. "It's not an obsession, Mike. It's the truth. We saw something out there, something real. I can't just pretend it didn't happen." "I'm not asking you to pretend," Mike said, his voice gentler now. "But you can't let it consume your whole life. When was the last time you left your apartment, or talked to someone other than me or your mom?" Sarah's silence was answer enough. "That's what I thought," Mike continued. "Look, a bunch of us are getting together this weekend. Why don't you come? It'll do you good to get out, be around people." Sarah's first instinct was to refuse, to retreat further into her self-imposed isolation. But a small part of her, the part that remembered what it was like to have a normal life, longed for human connection. I'll think about it," she said finally. "That's all I'm asking," Mike replied, relief evident in his voice. "Get some sleep, Sarah, please." After hanging up, Sarah stood in the kitchen, Mike's words echoing in her mind. Was she really becoming the person he described? Had her quest for the truth turned into something darker, more destructive? She glanced at the coffee maker, considering another cup to fuel her continued research. But Mike's plea for her to sleep tugged at her conscience. With a heavy sigh, Sarah dumped the remaining coffee down the sink and trudged to her bedroom. As she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, Sarah's mind raced with unanswered questions. The creature's piercing eyes, its inhuman strength, the way it had effortlessly torn through their campsite. The memories were as vivid now as they had been that terrifying night. How could she rest when that thing was still out there? Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and filled with nightmares. The next morning, Sarah awoke to the insistent buzzing of her alarm. For a moment, disoriented by actually waking up in her bed instead of slumped over her desk, she almost felt normal. But as consciousness fully returned, so did the weight of her obsession. She reached for her phone, immediately opening her news app to check for any overnight reports of strange sightings or attacks. Nothing. Sarah tried to ignore the mixture of relief and disappointment that washed over her. As she scrolled through her notifications, a text from her mother caught her eye. "Sweetie, please call me when you can. I'm worried about you." Guilt gnawed at Sarah's stomach. She had been neglecting her relationships, pushing away the people who cared about her most. With a deep breath, she hit the call button. "Sarah?" Her mother's voice was tentative, as if afraid of spooking her daughter. "Hi, Mom," Sarah replied, trying to inject some warmth into her tone. "Oh, honey, it's so good to hear your voice. How are you doing?" The concern in her mother's voice threatened to unravel Sarah's composure. I'm okay, Mom. Just been busy with work." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue. Her mother's sigh spoke volumes. "Sarah, I know you better than that. You're still obsessing over what happened in the woods, aren't you?" Sarah's silence was confirmation enough. "Sweetheart, I know it was a traumatic experience, but you can't let it define your whole life. Have you considered talking to someone? A therapist, maybe?" The suggestion sparked a flare of anger in Sarah. "I don't need a therapist, Mom. I need people to believe me, to understand that what we saw out there was real." "I believe that you believe it was real," her mother said carefully. "But honey, sometimes our minds can play tricks on us, especially in stressful situations. Maybe it wasn't exactly what you think." "No," Sarah interrupted, her voice rising. "I know what I saw. We all saw it. It wasn't a bear or a person in a costume or a shared hallucination. It was real, and it's still out there." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When her mother spoke again, her voice was heavy with sadness. "I just want my daughter back. The Sarah I know. Bright, ambitious, full of life. This obsession is consuming you, and I'm afraid I'm losing you." The raw emotion in her mother's voice cut through Sarah's defenses. Tears welled up in her eyes as the full weight of what she'd become crashed down on her. "I'm sorry, Mom," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I don't know how to let this go. I don't know if I can." "Oh, sweetheart," her mother soothed. "You don't have to do this alone. We're all here for you. Why don't you come home for a visit? Get away from your apartment, from all those maps and theories, just for a little while." Sarah hesitated, torn between her need to continue her investigation and the allure of escaping even briefly from the prison of her obsession. I'll think about it," she said finally, echoing her response to Mike from the night before. After ending the call, Sarah sat on the edge of her bed, head in her hands. Was everyone right? Had she gone too far down this rabbit hole? The rational part of her mind whispered that perhaps she should take a step back, try to regain some perspective. But as her eyes fell on the maps and notes covering her walls, Sarah felt the familiar pull of her obsession. She couldn't stop now. She was close to something. She could feel it. With renewed determination, she stood and made her way to her makeshift investigation board. Sarah's eyes scanned the pins on her map, each representing a potential Bigfoot sighting or unexplained attack. As she studied the pattern, something clicked in her mind. There was a rough circular shape to the incidents with a clear epicenter. The Poconos, Sarah breathed, her finger tracing the area on the map. It always comes back to the Poconos. A plan began to form in her mind. She needed to go back, to return to where it all started. Maybe there, in those dense forests, she would find the evidence she needed to prove to everyone that she wasn't crazy. Sarah's hands shook with a mixture of excitement and fear as she began to pack a bag. This was it, her chance to uncover the truth, to vindicate herself and her friends. As she threw clothes and supplies into her backpack, Sarah's phone buzzed with another text from Mike. "Hey, just checking in. Have you thought about this weekend?" Sarah stared at the message, guilt warring with her determination. She typed out a quick reply. "Something came up. Rain check?" She hit send before she could second-guess herself, then turned off her phone. She couldn't risk anyone trying to talk her out of this. As Sarah finished packing, her eyes fell on the small safe in her closet. With trembling fingers, she input the combination and opened it, revealing the 9mm handgun inside. She had purchased it shortly after returning from the ill-fated camping trip, driven by a newfound need for protection. Sarah hefted the weapon, feeling its weight in her hand. She had never fired it outside of a shooting range, and the thought of potentially using it against the creature both terrified and emboldened her. After a moment's hesitation, she tucked the gun into her bag. With one last look around her apartment, at the physical manifestation of her obsession, Sarah shouldered her backpack and headed for the door. As she turned the knob, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered a warning. Was she making a terrible mistake? Sarah pushed the doubt aside. She had come too far to turn back now. With a deep breath, she stepped out of her apartment and into the unknown. The drive to the Poconos was long and tense, with Sarah constantly checking her rearview mirror, half expecting to see the creature lumbering after her car. She had chosen a different campground from their previous trip, one deeper in the woods and less frequented by casual campers. As she navigated the winding mountain roads, Sarah's mind raced with possibilities. What if she actually found evidence? What if she came face to face with the creature again? The gun in her backpack felt like a lead weight, a reminder of the danger she was willingly walking into. It was late afternoon by the time Sarah reached the campground. The ranger at the entrance gave her an odd look as she signed in, probably wondering why a lone woman would choose to camp in such an isolated spot. Sarah forced a smile and made up a story about meeting friends who were arriving later. She drove to her assigned campsite, the dense forest pressing in on all sides. As she began to set up her tent, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sent her heart racing. "Get it together," she muttered to herself, hands shaking as she hammered tent stakes into the ground. "You came here for answers. You can't fall apart now." As darkness fell, Sarah sat by her small campfire, a map of the area spread across her lap. She had marked all the reported sightings and incidents in red, creating a rough search grid. Her plan was to spend the next few days systematically exploring the area, looking for any signs of the creature's presence. A twig snapped in the darkness beyond the fire's glow, causing Sarah to jump to her feet, her hand instinctively reaching for the gun in her pocket. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. "Is someone there?" Silence answered her, broken only by the crackling of her fire and the normal sounds of the nighttime forest. Sarah's eyes strained against the darkness, searching for any sign of movement. After several tense minutes, she slowly sat back down, but kept the gun in her hand. Sleep was elusive that night, with Sarah jerking awake at every sound. As the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, she gave up on rest and began to prepare for her search. Armed with her backpack, map, and gun, Sarah set out into the forest. She moved slowly, eyes scanning the ground for tracks or other signs of the creature's passage. Every so often she would stop to take photos or jot down notes in her journal. As the day wore on, Sarah's initial tension began to give way to frustration. She had covered a significant portion of her search grid without finding anything conclusive. A few times, she had thought she'd found promising tracks, only to realize they belonged to a bear or deer. It was late afternoon when Sarah stumbled upon something that made her blood run cold. In a small clearing, several trees had been snapped like matchsticks, their trunks bearing deep gouges that no known animal could have made. "Oh my God," Sarah breathed, her hands shaking as she took photo after photo of the scene. "This is it. This has to be it." As she circled the clearing, documenting everything she could, a low growl rumbled through the air. Sarah froze, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Slowly, she turned towards the source of the sound. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood a massive, dark shape. Even in the fading daylight, Sarah could make out the creature's hulking form, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly intelligence. "You're real," Sarah whispered, a mixture of terror and vindication washing over her. "I knew you were real." The creature took a step forward, and Sarah's survival instincts finally kicked in. She turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for direction. Behind her, she could hear the sound of pursuit, trees cracking as the creature gave chase. Sarah's lungs burned as she ran, panic giving her speed she didn't know she possessed. She glanced back over her shoulder, catching glimpses of the creature as it effortlessly bounded after her. In her terror, Sarah lost her footing on the uneven forest floor. She tumbled down a steep embankment, crying out in pain as rocks and branches tore at her skin. When she finally came to a stop at the bottom, the world spun around